My name is Nicole, 34 years old, and I went to my little sister's rehearsal dinner as the woman who sacrificed her youth to raise her. But the name card sitting in front of my plate at the Michelin star restaurant did not say sister or maid of honor. It read, Nicole, the bride's annoying freeloader. As the groom's entire family erupted into cruel laughter, I was expected to swallow the humiliation and walk out. Instead, I smiled, because the arrogant man laughing the loudest had no idea that insulting me today would be the most expensive mistake of his entire life. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to teach toxic people a lesson they will never forget. The evening started with the kind of tension you can feel in your teeth. Walking into the private dining room of Le Rêve Atlanta's most exclusive restaurant, I felt the heavy stares of the Carter family immediately. Dr. Reginald Carter and his wife Beatrice were the self-proclaimed medical royalty of the city. As an elite African-American family with generations of doctors, they never missed an opportunity to remind everyone of their status. And they certainly never missed an opportunity to remind me that they thought I was nothing. I wore a simple navy sheath dress I bought off the rack a few years ago. I prefer to keep my life and my wardrobe modest. But to Beatrice, my lack of designer labels was a personal insult to her high society aesthetic. As I took my seat at the long mahogany table, my eyes fell on the beautifully embossed place card. While everyone else had elegant calligraphy detailing their names and titles, mine was a cruel joke. Nicole, the bride's annoying freeloader. I picked up the heavy cardstock, running my thumb over the gold foil lettering. Across the table, Dr. Reginald Carter leaned back in his leather chair, a booming laugh escaping his chest. His friends and family joined in chuckling behind their crystal water glasses. He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored suit, pulled out a folded piece of paper, and tossed it across the table. It slid to a stop right next to my humiliating place card. "Since you are eating on my dime tonight, Nicole, you can make yourself useful," Reginald sneered, adjusting his expensive silk tie. "That is the wine bill for the VIP cocktail hour we just had. $2,500. A freeloader should at least pay the tip, or better yet, cover the tab. Consider it your contribution to the wedding, since we all know you cannot afford anything else." I did not cry. I did not shrink into my chair or run out of the room in tears like they desperately wanted me to. I looked down at the receipt, then calmly slid it back across the smooth wooden table until it rested in front of his plate. "I do not pay for cheap wine, Reginald," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level and devoid of any emotion. The laughter around the table died instantly. Beatrice slammed her manicured hand onto the table, making the silverware rattle. She glared at me, her eyes raking over my unbranded navy dress with absolute disgust. "How dare you speak to my husband that way?" Beatrice hissed, her voice dripping with venom. "You are nothing but a low-income burden on my son. Jamal is a brilliant surgeon, and your sister is lucky we are even allowing her to marry into our family. We are funding this entire $300,000 wedding. We are giving her the social elevation of a lifetime. And you show up here in a cheap dress, bringing nothing to the table but your embarrassing poverty. You should be on your knees thanking us for this charity." She leaned closer, her expensive perfume suffocating the air between us. "You have been riding on your sister's coattails since the day she met my son. You are a parasite, Nicole, and after tomorrow I will make sure you are permanently cut out of their lives." I simply took a sip of my sparkling water. They thought I was a broke, uneducated burden who spent my days scrubbing floors to get by. They thought Reginald was the financial savior of this wedding. What Beatrice and her arrogant husband did not know was that the $300,000 invoice for the venue, the catering, and the flowers had already been paid in full, and it was not paid by Reginald Carter. I looked at Jamal, the groom, sitting next to my sister Sydney. He kept his eyes glued to his plate, too much of a coward to defend the woman who had practically raised his future bride. When our parents abandoned us 12 years ago, I worked 3 grueling jobs to ensure Sydney never had to worry about a thing. I put her through medical school so she could become the brilliant surgical resident she was today. Jamal knew my sacrifices, yet he sat in silence while his parents publicly crucified me. You really believe your money makes you untouchable, I said quietly to Beatrice, maintaining intense eye contact. She smirked, lifting her chin proudly. In this world, money is everything, darling, and you have none. I smiled back, a genuine, chilling smile. You are absolutely right, Beatrice. Money does talk, and by the time this wedding weekend is over, you will learn exactly who holds the real power in this room. I will let you enjoy your cheap wine and your pathetic illusions of grandeur for tonight. Because tomorrow, reality is going to hit you harder than you can possibly imagine. Beatrice scoffed at my warning, turning her attention back to her plate of seared scallops, as if I were nothing more than a pesky insect she had just swatted away. Reginald chuckled, shaking his head at what he clearly thought was a pathetic empty threat from a broke woman. But before I could even reach for my water glass again, the sound of crystal slamming against hardwood echoed through the private dining room. Sydney had slammed her champagne flute down with such force, I was surprised the delicate stem did not shatter in her hand. Her face, usually so calm and composed in the high-pressure environment of the hospital operating room, was flushed with pure, unfiltered rage. She stood up abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the polished floor. She reached across the table, grabbed the humiliating place card sitting in front of me, and ripped it directly down the middle. She threw the torn pieces right onto Reginald's expensive silk tie. "Do not ever speak to my sister that way again," Sydney demanded, her voice trembling, but carrying an unmistakable authority. "She is not a freeloader. She is the only reason I am sitting at this table today." The room went dead silent. Jamal reached out to grab Sydney's arm, whispering furiously for her to sit down and stop causing a scene. But Sydney yanked her arm out of his grasp, refusing to back down. Jamal looked terrified, shrinking back into his chair, instead of standing up to support the woman he was supposed to marry in less than 24 hours. He looked at his mother with pleading eyes, silently begging her not to be angry, completely abandoning Sydney to face the lions alone. It was a pathetic display of cowardice that made my blood boil even hotter. "You all sit here and judge her for wearing an off-the-rack dress." Sydney continued, her eyes scanning the shocked faces of the Carter family guests. "You mock her because she does not flaunt wealth. But while you were buying luxury cars and vacationing in Europe, Nicole was working 14-hour shifts at a greasy diner. She scrubbed floors and waited tables until her hands bled just to keep a roof over my head after our parents abandoned us. She paid every single cent of my undergraduate tuition and my medical school expenses. I graduated with zero debt because of her sacrifices. I do not owe this family my success. I owe it entirely to my sister." The wealthy socialites and elite doctors around the table shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Beatrice's jaw tightened so hard I thought her teeth might crack. Her perfectly curated image of absolute superiority was cracking in front of her closest friends. A girl from a broken home funded by a waitress was marrying her perfect surgeon's son, and Sydney had just proudly announced it to the entire room. Beatrice hated nothing more than public embarrassment, and Sydney had just handed her a massive dose of it. Beatrice slowly stood up from her chair. She picked up her full glass of deeply pigmented red wine. She walked around the table, her heels clicking ominously against the floor, until she was standing directly next to Sydney. She feigned a polite, condescending smile. "Oh, Sydney, darling," Beatrice cooed, her voice deceptively sweet. "I understand you are feeling emotional and defensive about your humble beginnings. But in this family we carry ourselves with grace. We do not throw temper tantrums at Michelin-star restaurants." And with a flick of her wrist, Beatrice tilted the crystal goblet. The dark crimson liquid cascaded through the air, splashing violently across the front of Sydney's pristine white silk rehearsal dress. The stain spread instantly, ruining the expensive garment in a matter of seconds. Gasps erupted from the guests. Sydney stood frozen in shock, looking down at the ruined silk clinging to her skin. The cruelty of the act was staggering. It was not an accident. It was a calculated strike designed to strip Sydney of her dignity and remind her exactly who held the power. The red wine dripped onto the floor, pooling like blood at her feet, while the Carter guests watched in stunned silence, too afraid of Beatrice's wrath to intervene. Beatrice did not even flinch. She leaned in close to Sydney, dropping her voice to a venomous hiss that only those of us nearby could hear. "You need to learn your place, little girl," Beatrice whispered coldly. "You might be a doctor now, but you are still just a charity case from the gutter. We are the ones funding your lavish $300,000 wedding tomorrow. We are buying you a life you could never afford on your own. So you will sit down, you will shut your mouth, and you will show some respect to the people who own you. If I want to call your sister a freeloader, you will nod and agree, because without our money, you are absolutely nothing." I immediately stepped forward, placing myself directly between my sister and Beatrice. I grabbed a crisp white linen napkin from the table and gently began dabbing at the dark red stain ruining Sydney's beautiful silk dress. "Do not ever touch my sister again," I said, my voice low, but carrying a sharp edge that made Beatrice take a half step back. Her smug expression faltered for a fraction of a second, but she quickly recovered, crossing her arms over her chest defensively. This was the precise moment Jamal should have stepped up. This was the moment a real partner would have stood between his bride and his mother, demanding respect. Instead, Jamal finally moved, but not to protect Sydney. He reached out, grabbed Sydney's forearm, and physically pulled her away from me and his mother. "What is wrong with you?" Jamal hissed at Sydney, his eyes darting nervously toward his parents and the elite hospital board members watching the scene unfold. "Why are you escalating this? My mother just had an accident with her wine and you are acting like a crazy person. You need to apologize to her right now." Sydney stared at him, her mouth opening and closing as if the air had been knocked out of her lungs. She looked down at her ruined dress, then back up at the man she was supposed to marry. "Apologize?" Sydney choked out, her voice breaking. "Jamal, she intentionally threw her wine on me. She just told me I am a charity case. She just insulted the sister who raised me." Jamal tightened his grip on her arm, completely dismissing her pain. "She is stressed out, Sydney." Jamal argued, his tone dripping with condescension. "Do you have any idea how much pressure my parents are under right now? They went into massive debt to pay for this wedding, $300,000. They are draining their savings accounts and taking out high-interest loans just to give you the luxury wedding of your dreams. They are doing something your own deadbeat family could never afford to do. And instead of showing gratitude, you are embarrassing them in front of the most important doctors in Atlanta over a spilled drink. You need to swallow your pride and fix this to save face." I stood there listening to Jamal manipulate her, using guilt to break down her confidence. He was actively gaslighting the woman he supposedly loved, all to protect his parents' fragile egos and maintain their fake wealthy image. The sheer audacity of his lie was almost laughable. Massive debt, draining their accounts. Reginald and Beatrice had not spent a single dime on this wedding. I knew exactly who was paying the event planner, the florists, and the caterers, because all the invoices were being routed directly to my corporate accounting team. I let out a sharp, mocking laugh that cut through Jamal's desperate whispering. The sound echoed in the quiet room, drawing everyone's attention back to me. I stepped closer to Jamal, completely ignoring the furious glares from the rest of the Carter table. "Massive debt, Jamal?" I asked, my tone dripping with pure, unfiltered sarcasm. I tilted my head, looking him dead in the eye. "Are you absolutely sure about that? Are you sure your father is the one paying the event planner?" Jamal blinked, looking confused by my question. He glanced over his shoulder at his father, expecting Reginald to validate his claim. But Reginald did not look confident. For a split second, the arrogant surgeon looked like he had just swallowed a mouthful of broken glass. Beatrice stiffened beside him, her eyes darting nervously toward her husband, as the color drained from her perfectly contoured face. The brief moment of panic was instantly replaced by explosive rage. Dr. Reginald Carter slammed his heavy fists onto the dining table, shaking the crystal glasses and sending a silver fork clattering onto the hardwood floor. His face turned a dangerous shade of purple as he shot out of his leather chair. "Shut your mouth right now!" Reginald roared, his booming voice echoing off the expensive wallpaper of the private dining room. "I will not sit here and allow a broke, uneducated waitress to disrespect my family in a restaurant she has no business being inside." He stormed around the table, pointing a thick, accusatory finger right at my face. His chest heaved with manufactured indignation as he tried to regain control of the narrative. "I am the one writing the checks for this weekend," Reginald bellowed loud enough for the staff waiting in the hallway to hear. "I am the one allowing you to eat this food and breathe this air. You have pushed my patience to the absolute limit tonight. You will close your mouth, turn around, and walk out of that door right this second, or I swear to God, I will have the restaurant security drag you out onto the street where you belong." I stood my ground, entirely unfazed by his loud tantrum. Reginald thought his anger would intimidate me, but his empty threats only confirmed the pathetic truth he was hiding. Reginald snapped his fingers violently in the air, the sharp cracking sound cutting through the heavy tension in the private dining room. He waved his hand frantically toward the heavy mahogany doors, his face flushed with indignation. "Manager!" He bellowed, his loud voice echoing aggressively against the crystal chandeliers overhead. "Get the general manager in here right this second." He turned his glare back to me, adjusting his expensive suit jacket with a look of absolute disgust. "You are about to learn what happens when you disrespect people of our caliber, Nicole. I have spent thousands of dollars at this establishment over the years. They know exactly who I am. You will be dragged out of here kicking and screaming, and I will make sure you are permanently banned from ever stepping foot inside again." Within seconds, the heavy mahogany doors pushed open. The general manager of Le Rêve, an impeccably dressed man in a tailored tuxedo, walked into the room. He exuded a quiet, terrifying authority. Two massive security guards dressed in dark, tailored suits followed closely behind him, their expressions completely blank and unreadable. Beatrice smiled smugly, crossing her arms over her chest as she anticipated my public humiliation. She actually leaned closer to Jamal, whispering about how satisfying it would be to watch me get thrown out onto the rainy street like common trash. Reginald immediately pointed a manicured finger directly at my face. Finally, Reginald barked, stepping into the manager's path to assert his dominance. "I need this woman removed from the premises immediately. She is harassing my family, causing a massive disturbance and trespassing on a private VIP event that I am personally paying for. Have your security team escort her out the back door right now so she does not upset the rest of our elite guests. And bring me the check. I want her gone before dessert is served." The manager did not even blink at Reginald's loud demands. He did not nod, he did not apologize, and he did not acknowledge the arrogant doctor's commands in any way whatsoever. Instead, the manager walked right past Reginald, completely ignoring the man who claimed to be the most important person in the building. The manager stopped directly beside my chair. He clasped his hands behind his back and offered me a deep, highly respectful bow. "Ms. Nicole," the manager said, his tone incredibly polite and deferential, a stark contrast to the cold way he ignored Reginald. "Is everything all right here tonight? Do you require any assistance with these guests? We heard a commotion from the hallway and wanted to ensure your evening was proceeding to your exact specifications. Should I have my security team clear the room for you?" The collective gasp from the Carter family was deafening. Beatrice physically stumbled backward, her hand flying to her diamond necklace in absolute shock. Reginald stood completely frozen, his arm still suspended in the air, pointing at me, his mouth hanging open like a fish out of water. Jamal stared at the manager with wide, terrified eyes, his jaw practically hitting the floor. The wealthy hospital board members seated at the far end of the table began whispering frantically among themselves. I took a calm breath, looking up at the manager with a polite smile. I gave my head a subtle shake. "Thank you for your concern," I replied smoothly, making sure my voice carried across the dead silent room. Everything is under control for now. These guests were just getting a little too passionate about the wedding finances. We will not be needing security just yet. You can ask your team to stand down. Of course, Ms. Nicole, the manager said without a second of hesitation. He turned to the two large security guards and gave a sharp, authoritative nod. The guards immediately stepped back, exiting the room and quietly closing the heavy mahogany doors behind them. The manager bowed to me one last time, turned on his heel, and walked out without ever casting a single glance in Reginald's direction. For a full 10 seconds, the room was completely silent. The sheer humiliation of being blatantly ignored by the service staff broke whatever was left of Reginald's fragile ego. His face morphed from a dangerous shade of purple to a pale, sickly white. He looked at the closed doors, then down at me, his eyes bulging with absolute unhinged fury. "What kind of sick game are you playing here?" Reginald spat, his voice trembling with unrestrained anger. "How do you know the general manager of this restaurant? Why is he treating you like you own the place while disrespecting me?" Beatrice stepped forward, her perfectly contoured face twisted in absolute disgust. "It is obvious," Reginald, Beatrice hissed, glaring at me like I was something foul she had stepped on. "Look at her, a broke waitress from a trashy family. She is clearly sleeping with the restaurant staff to get special treatment. That is exactly how women like her survive in this city. They trade disgusting favors with managers to get free meals and act like they belong in high society. It is absolutely pathetic and shameful." Sydney gasped, taking a fiercely protective step toward me. "Are you out of your minds?" she yelled at Jamal's parents, completely ignoring her ruined silk dress. "Listen to yourselves. You are accusing my sister of sleeping with the staff just because they treated her with basic human respect." Jamal weakly pulled at Sydney's arm again. "Sydney, please," Jamal muttered, looking completely defeated. "Just let it go. Do not make my parents more upset." I simply picked up my clutch, savoring their toxic confusion, knowing my secret ownership of this building would destroy them soon enough. The rest of the rehearsal dinner passed in an agonizing, icy silence. The lavish 5-course meal that Reginald had bragged about tasted like ash to everyone at the table. Waiters moved around us like ghosts, silently clearing plates and refilling water glasses, deliberately avoiding eye contact with the Carter family. Reginald sat rigidly in his chair, his face a stony mask of suppressed rage, occasionally glaring daggers at me. He was completely stripped of his perceived authority in front of his wealthy colleagues, and he had no idea how it had happened. Jamal spent the remainder of the evening staring at his lap. He did not say another word to Sydney. He did not try to apologize or offer her a napkin for her ruined silk dress. He just sat there, a perfect picture of the cowardly boy he truly was. Sydney, however, sat tall. She did not cry and she did not try to cover the massive red wine stain blooming across her chest. She wore it like a badge of honor, a glaring visual reminder of the horrific family she was about to marry into. When the painfully awkward dessert course finally ended, the guests practically sprinted out of the private dining room. No one lingered to offer congratulations. They just wanted to escape the suffocating tension. I walked out of the restaurant alongside Sydney, keeping a protective hand on her back. As we stepped out into the cool Atlanta night air, the valet stand was a flurry of activity. The elite hospital board members were rushing to get their luxury imported vehicles. Reginald and Beatrice stood under the bright awning, aggressively demanding the valet bring their leased Mercedes immediately. They wanted to make a grand exit, clinging desperately to whatever shred of superiority they had left. I gave Sydney a tight hug by the entrance, promising I would see her first thing in the morning at the bridal suite. She gave me a weary nod and climbed into a rideshare vehicle, refusing to ride back to the hotel with Jamal. I turned and began walking across the sprawling parking lot toward my car. I drove an 8-year-old sedan. It was reliable, paid off, and completely unremarkable. I had no desire to flaunt my wealth with flashy sports cars. As I approached my vehicle, I heard the sharp clicking of Beatrice's designer heels rapidly closing the distance behind me. I turned around just as she marched up to me, her face twisted in an ugly sneer. Her expensive perfume hung heavy in the damp night air. "You think you won something tonight?" Beatrice hissed, pointing a manicured finger at my chest. "You think because some lowly restaurant manager showed you a little respect that you are suddenly on our level. You are delusional, Nicole." I leaned against the door of my old sedan, crossing my arms and looking at her with absolute boredom. "Are you really following me into a parking lot, Beatrice?" I asked calmly. "Do you not have a leased Mercedes to aggressively wait for?" Her eyes flashed with fury, but she quickly masked it with a cold, hateful smile. "Enjoy your little moment of rebellion tonight, Nicole," she said, her voice dropping to a threatening whisper. "Because tomorrow is about my son and my family. We are the ones paying for the grand ballroom, the floral arrangements, and the string quartet. We are giving your sister a wedding that people like you only see in magazines. And I promise you this. I will personally speak to the photographer first thing in the morning. You will be seated in the back row during the ceremony, and you will be cropped out of every single wedding photograph. When the society pages print the pictures of this event, it will look like you do not even exist. You will not be a stain on our family legacy." I looked at her, truly amazed by her unshakable arrogance. She was standing on a sinking ship, yet she was still obsessed with arranging the deck chairs. "Make sure you get my good side before you crop me out, Beatrice," I replied smoothly. I unlocked my car door and pulled the handle. "Have a wonderful night. Get plenty of sleep. You are going to need all your energy for tomorrow." I got into my car and shut the door in her face, cutting off whatever venomous response she was about to spit at me. Through the window, I watched her storm back toward the valet stand, her fists clenched at her sides. The interior of my car was quiet and peaceful. I took a deep breath, letting the tension of the evening slowly leave my body. Then I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone. I opened my messages and tapped on the contact name for my lead corporate attorney. The Carter family thought tomorrow was going to be their crowning social achievement. They thought they could humiliate my sister and me and simply sweep us under the rug. It was time to show them what real power looked like. I typed out a message to my lawyer, my fingers flying across the glowing screen. "Prepare the commercial eviction notice for the Carter Premium Surgery Center. I want the documents finalized and ready to be served by 7 p.m. tomorrow. Do not offer any extensions." I hit send, placed the phone on the passenger seat, and started the engine. The Carters wanted a memorable wedding weekend, and I was going to give them exactly that. The morning sun broke through the heavy rain clouds, casting a harsh, bright light over the sprawling country estate, where the wedding was being held. I arrived at the bridal suite precisely at 7 o'clock, feeling a quiet sense of cold anticipation. The commercial eviction notice for the Carter Premium Surgery Center was already drafted by my legal team and waiting for my final approval. But right now, my only priority was making sure Sydney survived the absolute nightmare of this day. I pushed open the heavy oak doors of the bridal suite, expecting to find a chaotic flurry of makeup artists, hairstylists, and wedding planners rushing around. Instead, the massive room was eerily quiet. The scent of expensive white roses and strong hairspray hung heavy in the air. Sydney was nowhere to be seen, presumably taking a shower in the master bathroom to prepare for the long morning ahead. But sitting on a plush velvet sofa right in the center of the room was Beatrice. She wore a lavish silk robe trimmed in expensive ostrich feathers, holding a crystal flute of sparkling champagne. She looked up when I entered, her lips curling into a deeply satisfied, malicious smirk. "Good morning, Nicole," she practically purred, taking a slow, deliberate sip of her drink. "You are just in time to get dressed." I ignored her entirely and walked straight toward the rolling garment rack where our dresses had been carefully hung the night before. Sydney's breathtaking white gown was safely sealed in its protective plastic bag, hanging untouched. Next to it was my custom navy blue bridesmaid dress. But as I drew closer, I realized something was horribly wrong. The garment bag had been unzipped, and the fabric spilling out of it looked completely mangled. I reached out and pulled the plastic aside. My dress was completely destroyed. Someone had taken a pair of sharp fabric scissors and slashed the beautiful gown to ribbons. The fitted bodice was cut straight down the middle, and the flowing chiffon skirt was shredded into uneven, jagged strips that pooled sadly on the floor. It was completely unwearable. The destruction was so violent and calculated that it sent a cold shiver down my spine. I turned slowly to look at Beatrice. She had not moved from the sofa, but her eyes were gleaming with sick delight. "Oh dear," Beatrice said, feigning a dramatic sigh and placing a hand over her heart. "It seems the alterations department made a terrible error late last night. The seamstress must have been incredibly overworked. Such a tragedy, really. I suppose you cannot stand at the altar with my son and your sister looking like a shredded piece of garbage." She set her champagne flute on the glass coffee table and gestured lazily toward a small wooden chair in the corner of the room. Resting on the seat was a folded stack of stiff gray fabric. "Since we cannot have you ruining the aesthetic of the ceremony, I took the liberty of finding you a suitable alternative," Beatrice continued, her voice dripping with venomous condescension. "One of the hotel maids was kind enough to lend a spare uniform. It is washed and pressed. Go ahead and put it on Nicole. It suits your background perfectly, and no one will even notice you standing in the back row where you belong." She actually expected me to put on a maid's uniform and serve her guests. She wanted to physically strip me of my dignity and force me to play the role of the impoverished servant she so desperately wanted me to be. I looked at the shredded navy fabric hanging from the rack, and then I looked at the pathetic gray uniform sitting on the chair. I did not scream. I did not throw a tantrum or demand an apology. I simply walked over to the sofa and looked down at Beatrice with absolute icy calm. "You know, Beatrice," I said, keeping my voice deadly quiet. "You are not the first person who thought they could break me by destroying my things." Beatrice rolled her eyes, leaning back into the velvet cushions. "Please save the sob story. Just put on the uniform and make yourself useful. The last time someone tried to destroy my property to teach me a lesson, it was my own deadbeat mother." I continued, completely ignoring her interruption. I was 19 years old. I had just bought my first laptop using money I saved from working double shifts at the diner. I needed it for my college classes. My mother wanted that money to fund her gambling addiction. When I refused to give her my savings, she took a hammer to my laptop and smashed it into pieces right in front of me. She told me I was arrogant for thinking I could ever be anything more than what she was. Beatrice let out a short, mocking laugh. "Fascinating family history. Truly inspiring. Are you going to put the uniform on, or do I need to call security to escort you off the property?" I leaned slightly closer to her, making sure she heard every single word clearly. "My mother thought destroying my only valuable possession would make me submit," I whispered. "Instead, I pressed charges for destruction of property. I had her arrested. She spent a week in a holding cell, and now she lives in a dilapidated trailer park while I decide the fate of people like you. She found out the hard way that I do not cry when people cross me. I retaliate." Beatrice's smug smile finally faltered. For the first time, a flicker of genuine uncertainty crossed her face. "You think cutting up a piece of fabric gives you power over me?" I asked, standing up straight and looking down at her. "You are playing a very dangerous game, Beatrice, and you have absolutely no idea what the stakes are." Beatrice let out a dismissive laugh, waving her manicured hand as if to brush away my words. "You are utterly ridiculous, Nicole," Beatrice scoffed, picking up her champagne flute. "You can make all the empty threats you want, but the reality is, you have nothing to wear. This is an elite black tie event. I will not have my family humiliated by you walking down the aisle in rags or whatever cheap mall dress you can scrape together. Since you refuse to put on the maid's uniform, you need to leave the venue immediately. Get out before my son and your sister arrive, or I will have security escort you out." I did not move an inch. I reached into my leather tote bag and pulled out my phone. I unlocked the screen, dialed a number I knew by heart, and lifted the device to my ear. Beatrice watched me with a mixture of amusement and irritation, clearly thinking I was calling a cab to take me home. "Yes, this is Nicole," I said smoothly into the receiver, making sure my voice carried across the quiet bridal suite. "I am currently at the estate venue in the bridal suite. I have experienced a wardrobe emergency." "Yes, the navy bridesmaid dress was destroyed. I need the backup option we discussed delivered immediately. The midnight blue silk. Yes, the couture piece. I need it here in exactly 20 minutes. Thank you." I ended the call and slipped the phone back into my bag. I walked over to the velvet sofa, sat down on the opposite end from Beatrice, and casually crossed my legs. "Who on earth was that?" Beatrice demanded, her amused smirk slipping just a fraction. "Are you calling one of your waitress friends to bring you a polyester hand-me-down?" I smiled warmly at her. "You will see soon enough, Beatrice. Why do we not just sit quietly and enjoy our morning?" For the next 20 minutes, the room was suffocatingly tense. Beatrice paced the floor, occasionally checking her diamond-encrusted watch and muttering under her breath about my blatant disrespect. I remained perfectly still, scrolling through emails on my phone, reviewing the final drafts of the commercial eviction notice for the Carter Clinic. Exactly 20 minutes later, a sharp, authoritative knock echoed on the heavy oak doors of the bridal suite. Before Beatrice could turn around, the doors swung open. A tall, impeccably dressed woman, wearing a sharp black blazer and white gloves, stepped into the room. Behind her walked two assistants carrying an enormous garment bag crafted from heavy velvet with a gold-embossed logo of one of the most exclusive haute couture designers in the world. "Ms. Nicole," the woman said, offering a respectful bow. "We apologize for the delay. We brought the midnight blue gown straight from the vault as requested." The assistants unzipped the massive velvet bag and the dress was revealed. It was a breathtaking masterpiece. The gown was constructed from yards of midnight blue silk organza hand, embroidered with thousands of tiny Swarovski crystals that caught the morning light and scattered brilliant reflections across the room. It was an authentic haute couture piece that retailed for $45,000. It was the kind of dress reserved for Hollywood royalty and international billionaires. The champagne flute slipped from Beatrice's hand and shattered against the floor. She stared at the gown with her mouth hanging wide open, her eyes darting frantically between the blinding crystals and my calm face. The sheer display of impossible wealth completely short-circuited her brain. "How did you get that?" Beatrice gasped, her voice trembling with a toxic mixture of shock and aggressive envy. "That is a runway piece. That designer requires a personal invitation just to enter their showroom. You cannot possibly afford that." I stood up and walked toward the gown, gently running my hand over the exquisite silk. "The concierge team is very accommodating to their top-tier clients," I replied casually. Beatrice shook her head violently, her face flushing with furious denial. "No," Beatrice yelled, pointing a shaking finger at me. "You are lying. You are a broke waitress. You probably maxed out a dozen predatory credit cards just to rent that thing for the day. You are going to put yourself in massive debt just to fake being rich in front of my friends. It is pathetic. You are trying to outshine my family, but everyone will know you are just playing dress-up. You are a fraud, Nicole." I turned to look at Beatrice, watching the veins pop on her forehead. "You seem very familiar with the concept of using credit cards to fake being rich." "Beatrice," I said, keeping my tone deadly calm. "Tell me, is that how Reginald is paying for this wedding?" Before Beatrice could even process my accusation about Reginald's finances, the heavy oak doors of the bridal suite swung open once again. I expected to see the wedding planner, or perhaps the makeup team, finally arriving to begin the morning preparations. Instead, the air in my lungs completely vanished. Standing in the doorway, looking entirely out of place in the opulent high society setting, were Gary and Brenda, my parents. It had been exactly 12 years since I last saw their faces, 12 years since they packed their bags in the middle of the night, leaving a foreclosed house, a stack of unpaid utility bills, and a terrified 14-year-old Sydney crying in her dark bedroom. They looked older and entirely worn down by years of bad choices, but they carried the exact same sleazy arrogance they always had. Gary was wearing an ill-fitting rented tuxedo that bunched awkwardly at the shoulders, and Brenda had on a garish sequined dress that looked like it belonged in a cheap roadside casino rather than a daytime estate wedding. Beatrice immediately regained her smug composure, her lips curling into a deeply triumphant smile. "Ah, finally," Beatrice announced, clapping her hands together in mock delight. "The real family has arrived. I must say it is so wonderful to see a mother and father ready to support their beautiful daughter on her special day." At that exact moment, the bathroom door clicked open and Sydney stepped out wearing her white silk bridal robe. Her wet hair wrapped tightly in a towel, she froze instantly. The color drained from her face so fast, I thought she might physically collapse onto the floor. She stared at the two strangers who had abandoned us, as if she was looking at ghosts returning from the grave. "Hello, sweetheart," Gary said, stepping aggressively further into the room and spreading his arms wide in a sickening display of fake paternal affection. "Look at you all grown up and about to marry a wealthy surgeon. Your mother and I could not be more proud of the woman you have become." Sydney could not even form a coherent word. She just looked at me, her eyes wide with absolute sheer panic and betrayal. "What are you doing here?" I demanded, stepping squarely between Gary and my terrified sister, shielding her from his predatory gaze. "Who let you onto this private property?" Gary let out a loud, obnoxious laugh, adjusting his cheap clip-on bow tie with thick, clumsy fingers. "My new best friend, Dr. Reginald Carter, personally invited us," he declared, his chest puffing out with unearned pride. "A man of his incredible stature understands the importance of family tradition. He tracked us down and explained that he simply could not have a pathetic spinster sister walking his future daughter-in-law down the aisle. It would look terrible to his elite friends, so Reginald paid me a very generous $10,000 cash to fly down here and do the honors myself. He is a very generous man, Nicole. You should really learn to respect your betters instead of causing trouble." My blood turned to absolute ice. Reginald had actually paid the man who abandoned his own children $10,000 just to humiliate me and maintain his fake perfect image for the society pages. He essentially bought my deadbeat father to play a convenient role in his theatrical production. Brenda finally spoke up, stepping out from behind Gary with a fake syrupy smile. "We are here to fix things, Sydney," she cooed, reaching out a hand adorned with cheap chipped nail polish. "We are your real parents, not her." Gary turned his attention to the stunning midnight blue haute couture gown hanging behind me. His greedy eyes widened as he took in the thousands of sparkling crystals catching the light. "Well, look at that," he whistled. "You always were a sneaky, selfish girl, Nicole. Stealing money to buy fancy dresses while your own parents struggle to get by. But your little reign of control is officially over. We are taking over from here. The real parents are in charge now." He took a heavy step toward me, his face hardening into the familiar cruel expression I remembered so vividly from my miserable childhood. "You are dismissed," Gary sneered. "Take your stolen dress and get out of here. You are ruining the family picture and we have a very important high-class wedding to attend." When I did not immediately submit and move toward the door, Gary lost his temper. He lunged forward and shoved his heavy hand hard against my shoulder, trying to physically push me out of the way. "Move it right now, you ungrateful brat," he barked. "Do not touch her." Sydney screamed, her voice cracking with raw, violent emotion. She launched herself forward, pushing Gary's arm away from me with surprising strength. "Get away from my sister right now." Gary stumbled back, feigning shock. "Now, Sydney, is that any way to speak to the man who gave you life on your wedding day? You did not give me a life!" Sydney yelled, her entire body shaking with uncontrollable rage. "You left me to starve. Nicole is the only parent I have ever had. Get out of my room. Both of you get out right now before I call the police." Beatrice let out a dramatic, heavy sigh, shaking her head in utter disappointment. "Oh, Sydney, darling, please calm down. You are making a terrible, embarrassing scene. Reginald went through a lot of trouble and expense to reunite your broken family. You should be thanking us for fixing your messy background instead of yelling at your own father." Before I could even respond to Beatrice's ridiculous statement, the heavy oak doors of the bridal suite pushed open yet again. Dr. Reginald Carter strode into the room looking incredibly pleased with himself. He wore a custom-tailored morning suit, with a pristine white rose pinned to his lapel. He carried himself with the inflated arrogance of a king surveying his conquered territory. He walked straight past me and stood shoulder to shoulder with Gary, placing a firm, supportive hand on my deadbeat father's cheap rented tuxedo jacket. Reginald smiled at Sydney, who was still shaking with anger. "Now, Sydney, there is no need for all this hostility," Reginald said, his booming voice filling the room with fake warmth. "My wife is absolutely right. We went through a great deal of trouble to locate your parents. A wedding of this magnitude, a Carter family wedding, requires a proper image. Real families have a mother and a father standing proudly by their daughter. We simply could not allow you to walk down the aisle accompanied by your spinster sister. It would send the wrong message to our elite guests. It would make you look like a tragic charity case, and we cannot have that reflecting poorly on Jamal's flawless reputation." He looked me up and down with utter contempt, clearly enjoying the fact that he had brought my greatest childhood trauma directly into the bridal suite just to put me in my place. He thought his wealth and status gave him the absolute right to manipulate our lives for his own social benefit. "You should be thanking me, Nicole." Reginald continued, puffing out his chest proudly. "I spent $10,000 of my own hard-earned money to bring your parents here and fix this broken family dynamic. I am giving your sister the gift of a traditional, respectable background, something you could never provide no matter how many diner floors you scrubbed. Now I suggest you stop being so selfish. Put on whatever rags you brought, stand in the back row, and let the real adults handle this beautiful celebration." Sydney gripped the edges of her silk robe, her knuckles turning completely white. "You are a monster," she whispered, staring at Reginald with pure, unadulterated hatred. "You brought the people who starved me into my bridal suite just for a photo opportunity. You do not care about family at all." I stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on Sydney's shoulder to calm her. I looked directly into Reginald's smug, arrogant face. $10,000 is a lot of money to spend on a fake family, Reginald," I said, keeping my voice dangerously low and steady. "Tell me, where exactly did you get that cash?" Reginald scoffed, waving his hand dismissively, as if I had just asked the most foolish question in the world. "I am a highly successful surgeon, you insolent girl. $10,000 is absolute pocket change to a man of my stature. I paid for this entire $300,000 wedding without even batting an eye. I am the sole financial provider for this entire weekend." I slowly reached into my leather tote bag and pulled out my phone. I tapped the screen, opening a specific audio file that my corporate security team had intercepted and forwarded to me earlier that morning. "You see, Reginald," I replied calmly, "when you claim to be the sole financial provider for a massive event at a luxury estate, you should make sure you actually pay the vendors. Or at the very least, you should not leave desperate voicemails on the wedding planner's answering machine at 2 in the morning." Reginald's smug smile vanished instantly. His face went entirely slack. Beatrice frowned, looking nervously between her husband and the phone in my hand. "What are you talking about?" Beatrice demanded, her voice trembling slightly. I turned the volume on my phone all the way up and pressed play. The audio filled the dead-silent bridal suite. It was Reginald's voice, but the arrogant, booming tone was completely gone. Instead, he sounded panicked, breathless, and utterly pathetic. "Marcus, please, you have to give me an extension." The recorded voice of Reginald begged, echoing off the high ceilings of the room. "I just need 30 more days. My credit cards are completely maxed out. I have zero liquidity left. I cannot even afford the catering deposit for my son's wedding this weekend. If my elite friends find out I am broke, my clinic will be ruined. Please, I just need $10,000 in cash today to pay off the bride's trashy parents so they will show up and make us look good. I will pay you back with 20% interest, I swear it. Just wire the funds before the bank cuts me off completely." I paused the audio, letting the heavy silence slam into the room like a physical weight. Gary and Brenda stared at Reginald, their greedy eyes suddenly widening with sudden realization. The wealthy doctor who had promised them a massive payday was entirely broke. He had borrowed money from a predatory high-interest loan shark just to pay Gary off. Reginald looked like he was going to vomit right there on the expensive carpet. His face turned a sickly shade of gray, and he took a shaky step backward. Beatrice brought a trembling hand to her mouth, staring at her husband in absolute horror as her perfect high society illusion shattered into a million pieces. "You have not paid a single cent toward this wedding, Reginald," I said, my voice slicing through the heavy air like a razor blade. "You are drowning in massive debt. You are a complete fraud. And you have the absolute audacity to stand in this room and call me a charity case." The sheer weight of his exposed secret finally snapped whatever fragile thread of sanity Reginald had left. His face contorted into an ugly mask of pure desperation and rage. He let out a primal, furious yell and lunged directly across the bridal suite toward me. His heavy hands violently grabbed at the air as he tried to snatch the phone right out of my grip. I stepped back quickly, pivoting on my heel, so his grasping fingers caught nothing but empty space. Reginald stumbled forward, his expensive leather shoes slipping awkwardly on the thick hotel carpet before he caught his balance. "Give me that phone right now, you psychotic thief!" Reginald screamed, his chest heaving as he pointed a shaking finger at my face. "You hacked my private communications. That is a federal crime. I am going to have you thrown in a federal prison for illegal wiretapping. You cannot play a recording of my private business dealings. It is entirely illegal, and I will sue you for every miserable penny you have ever made." I slipped the phone safely back into my leather tote bag, keeping my eyes locked on his flushed, panicked face. "You really are out of your depth, Reginald," I replied, my voice echoing calmly in the tense room. "I did not hack anything. You left that pathetic voicemail on the official answering machine of the luxury event planning firm coordinating this wedding. When you leave a voicemail on a corporate line, the company owns that recording. And since my corporate team works extremely closely with that particular firm, they were more than happy to forward the audio of a deadbeat client trying to defraud them. There was absolutely nothing illegal about it. But defrauding a vendor by signing contracts you know you cannot fulfill is certainly a matter for the authorities." Beatrice let out a sharp, terrified sob, pressing her hands against her temples. "Reginald, tell me this is a lie," Beatrice pleaded, her voice cracking under the weight of her crumbling reality. "Tell me you did not borrow money from a loan shark. Tell me we are not bankrupt. What about my country club dues? What about the lease on the new Mercedes?" "Shut up, Beatrice," Reginald snapped viciously, turning his rage toward his own wife. "Not now. I am handling this." But he was not handling anything. The power dynamic in the room had violently shifted. Gary, who had been standing proudly beside Reginald just moments ago, suddenly stepped away as if the arrogant doctor had a contagious disease. Gary's greedy eyes darted around the room before settling back on Reginald with a look of absolute disgust. "Wait a minute," Gary interjected, his loud voice cutting through Beatrice's quiet sobbing. "You mean to tell me you do not have my $10,000? You dragged me and my wife all the way down here to play the loving parents, and you are completely broke." Reginald glared at Gary, his upper lip curling in contempt. "Do not speak to me, you filthy beggar," Reginald spat. "I am a respected surgeon. I will get your money eventually. Just do what I hired you to do and get this woman out of here." Gary let out a harsh barking laugh. "I am not doing a damn thing for a man with empty pockets," Gary sneered, crossing his arms over his cheap rented tuxedo. "You are no better than I am, Doc. In fact, you might be worse. At least I know I am trash. You are just wearing a fancy suit to hide your garbage." Reginald looked like he was about to physically attack my father. He balled his hands into tight fists, his entire body trembling with explosive fury. "I will destroy all of you," Reginald roared, his voice hoarse. "I am Dr. Reginald Carter. I am the patriarch of this family. I own this wedding and I demand security right now. I want her out." Right on cue, the heavy oak doors of the bridal suite clicked and swung open. Reginald spun around, a triumphant smirk momentarily flashing across his pale face as he expected to see the hotel security guards he had aggressively demanded earlier. He stood tall, ready to issue his tyrannical orders. But the people stepping into the room were not the private security staff. Walking through the doorway was the estate's head coordinator, an impeccably dressed woman carrying a sleek leather folder. And flanking her on either side were two massive uniformed police officers from the local precinct. Their heavy-duty belts clinked softly as they stepped onto the plush carpet, their expressions stern and completely unreadable. Reginald puffed out his chest, pointing a finger directly at me. "Officers, thank God you are here," Reginald commanded, his booming voice returning. "This woman has been harassing my family and illegally recording my private conversations. I am the sole financial backer of this VIP event, and I want her arrested and removed from the property immediately." The two police officers did not even look at me. They kept their eyes fixed entirely on Reginald. The head coordinator stepped forward, opening her leather folder and pulling out a thick stack of legal documents stamped with an official court seal. Dr. Reginald Carter, the coordinator, asked, her tone strictly professional and devoid of any warmth. "Yes, that is me," Reginald replied, adjusting his lapels. "Now arrest her." One of the police officers stepped forward, effectively blocking Reginald's path to me. He took the documents from the coordinator and held them out toward Reginald. "Dr. Carter, I am serving you with a legally binding restraining order," the officer stated, his deep voice leaving no room for argument. "This document was filed early this morning by the anonymous benefactor, who holds the master contract for this entire estate and who has paid the $300,000 invoice in full. The legal owner of this event has explicitly banned you from entering the bridal suite, the groom suite, and any private preparation areas on this property. You are completely stripped of all authority regarding this wedding. If you do not vacate this room immediately, you will be placed in handcuffs and arrested for criminal trespassing." Reginald stared at the papers in the officer's hand, his jaw dropping open in sheer absolute disbelief. The room went completely silent as the arrogant doctor finally realized he had walked directly into a trap he could not buy his way out of. The sheer silence in the room was deafening. Reginald Carter, the man who had spent the last 24 hours terrorizing my sister, was now standing completely frozen in the center of the bridal suite. The police officer did not give him time to recover his shattered ego. He pointed a firm finger toward the open door, instructing Reginald to gather his wife and exit the premises immediately. Beatrice let out a humiliated wail as she practically ran out into the hallway to escape the staring eyes of the hotel staff. Reginald swallowed hard, his face pale and sickly. He turned and walked out the heavy oak doors, shutting firmly behind him. Gary and Brenda, my wonderful deadbeat parents, realized there was no money left for them to steal. They quietly slipped out the side door, disappearing back into their miserable life. Sydney let out a massive breath of relief, sinking onto the edge of the velvet sofa. But the peace did not last long. Less than 2 minutes later, the heavy oak doors flew open with such violent force they slammed against the wall. Jamal stormed into the room, his face twisted in absolute fury. He was fully dressed in his custom-tailored tuxedo, but he looked nothing like a loving groom eager to marry his beautiful bride. He marched directly toward Sydney, completely ignoring the fact that she was visibly shaken and still wearing her bridal robe. "What the hell did you two just do?" Jamal yelled, his voice cracking with unchecked anger. "I just saw my parents being escorted out of the building by the police. My mother is having a panic attack in the parking lot, and my father is threatening to sue the entire estate." Jamal pointed a shaking finger directly at my face. "You are a psychopath, Nicole. You come here dressed in some stolen designer gown and you humiliate my family on the most important day of my life. I am not going to let you ruin this for us." I did not flinch. "Your father humiliated himself, Jamal," I replied coldly. "He forged contracts and lied about paying for this venue. He brought our deadbeat parents here to emotionally abuse Sydney. He got exactly what he deserved. Jamal aggressively waved his hand, completely dismissing everything I just said. I do not care about any of that, Jamal snapped. He turned his furious glare back to Sydney, looming over her in a pathetic attempt at intimidation. I am giving you a choice right now, Sydney. You either tell your crazy sister to pack her bags and leave this property immediately, or there is no wedding. I will not stand at that altar if she is in the room. You have exactly 2 minutes to decide. Kick her out, or I am calling the whole thing off and telling all 300 of our guests that you are a toxic, manipulative liar who drove my family away. Sydney stood up, her eyes wide with disbelief. You are giving me an ultimatum, she asked, her voice trembling. Jamal, your parents have done nothing but treat us like garbage since we arrived. Your mother threw wine on me. Your father hired the people who abandoned me. And you are defending them. Jamal sneered, crossing his arms over his chest. I am defending the people who are actually trying to give you a decent life. Jamal fired back, his voice dripping with venomous condescension. Do you have any idea what my family is doing for you today? We are giving you a massive social elevation. You are an orphan from a broken home with zero connections. By marrying me, you are stepping into a world you could never access on your own. My parents are elite surgeons. We have generational wealth and status. You should be down on your knees thanking us for allowing you into our circle. Instead, you let your broke waitress sister orchestrate this embarrassment just because she is jealous of my family. Sydney stared at him as if she was looking at a complete stranger. The man she thought she loved was standing right in front of her, parroting the exact same toxic garbage his mother spewed. You really think I owe you? Sydney whispered, her voice barely audible. You really think I am lucky to have you? Jamal scoffed, adjusting his tuxedo jacket with arrogant finality. I think you need to look at the reality of your situation, Sydney. Without my last name, you are just another struggling resident with a pathetic background. Now make your choice. Send her away right now, or I am walking out that door, and you can explain to everyone why you ruined your own wedding. I am entirely serious about this final decision right now today. Before Jamal could reinforce his toxic ultimatum, a loud commotion echoed from the hallway outside the bridal suite. A flustered hotel security guard shouted a warning, but it was too late. Beatrice shoved her way past the heavy oak doors and burst back into the room. She was completely out of breath, her perfectly styled hair now a disheveled mess. She had clearly slipped away from the police escort, driven back by pure unhinged desperation. She completely ignored the fact that she was actively violating a legal order by stepping foot back inside. Do not think for 1 second that you have won! Beatrice shrieked, her voice cracking as she marched aggressively toward Sydney. You think because your sister played a dirty trick with the venue contract that you hold the power here. You are absolutely delusional. Beatrice reached frantically into her oversized designer handbag and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents. She did not hand them over politely. She reared back and threw the heavy stack of papers directly at Sydney. The heavy packet hit Sydney hard in the chest before scattering across the plush hotel carpet. Sign it, Beatrice demanded, her chest heaving as she pointed a manicured finger at the fallen papers. Sign that prenuptial agreement right this second, or my son walks away. We know exactly what you are doing. You orchestrated this drama to distract us, so you could lock down Jamal without a contract. You are nothing but a gold digger from a broken home, but I will not let some ghetto orphan steal a single dime of my son's future surgeon salary. Jamal did not tell his mother to stop or ask why she risked arrest by returning. Instead, he crossed his arms and nodded in agreement. My mother is right, Jamal said, his tone cold and clinical. If you really love me and not my family name, you will sign the agreement right now to prove it. Sydney slowly crouched down and picked up the scattered pages. Her hands were shaking, but she forced herself to read the bold legal text printed on the very first page. I watched her eyes dart back and forth across the paragraphs as she processed the horrific terms they were trying to force upon her minutes before the wedding. The document was not a standard prenuptial agreement. It was an absolute trap. As Sydney flipped to the third page, her breath hitched. This says I waive all rights to marital support, even if I sacrifice my career to raise children. Sydney read aloud, her voice barely a whisper. It says any property purchased during the marriage remains the sole property of the primary earner. That is standard protection, Beatrice snapped, crossing her arms defensively. Jamal is going to be a top-tier surgeon. We are not letting you drain his bank accounts if you decide to get lazy and file for divorce in 5 years. But Sydney was not looking at the financial division clause anymore. Her eyes had locked onto a highly specific paragraph buried near the back of the contract. She looked up at Jamal, her expression shifting from shock to profound disgust. There is an infidelity clause in here, Sydney said, holding the paper up. But it only applies to me. If you cheat on me, the contract states that I still leave the marriage with absolutely nothing. Why would your lawyers specifically write a clause protecting you if you decide to have an affair, Jamal? Jamal shifted his weight, avoiding her direct gaze. It is just standard legal jargon, he muttered, looking at the floor. My lawyers just wanted to cover all potential liabilities. It does not mean anything. Just sign the paper so we can get past this nightmare and get married. Sydney hesitated. For a moment, the terrified little girl who had grown up with nothing flashed across her eyes. She had worked so hard to build a respectable life to escape the poverty our parents left us in. She had convinced herself that marrying into the Carter family was the ultimate symbol of her success. But looking at the cold, hard legal document in her hands, she finally realized the horrifying truth. They did not view her as a human being or partner. They viewed her as a liability that needed to be legally managed and controlled. They wanted to strip her of her rights, lock her into a toxic dynamic, and ensure she could never fight back if Jamal mistreated her. Signing that paper meant entering a prison worse than the childhood we escaped. She looked at the pen Beatrice shoved toward her, then back at the contract. The man standing right in front of her was not her savior. He was preparing to destroy her. I reached out and gently took the heavy gold pen right out of Sydney's trembling fingers. Without breaking eye contact with Jamal, I tossed the pen over my shoulder. It clattered loudly against the hardwood floor, rolling under the velvet sofa. Then I grabbed the thick stack of legal documents from Sydney's lap and tore them straight down the middle. Beatrice let out a high-pitched shriek as the ripped pages fluttered to the floor. "Are you completely insane?" Beatrice yelled, grabbing the sides of her head. "That is a legally binding document drafted by the top family law attorneys in Atlanta. Do you have any idea how much money we spent to have that drawn up?" "It is garbage," I replied, stepping firmly between my sister and the two monsters trying to trap her. "And Sydney will not be signing a single page of it today or ever." Jamal took a threatening step forward, his face contorted into an ugly defensive sneer. "Who do you think you are, Nicole?" Jamal spat, his voice laced with absolute venom. "You are nothing but a jealous, bitter woman. You have spent your entire pathetic life working useless dead-end jobs making minimum wage. You have no career, no status, and no future. You are intentionally sabotaging Sydney's only chance at a real life because you know you will never have a fraction of the success I have achieved. I am a top-tier surgeon. I save lives. I make more money in a single month than you will see in an entire decade. My wealth is exactly why this contract is necessary to protect my assets from greedy parasites like you. You are just mad because nobody will ever want to marry a broke loser with zero prospects." I let him finish his arrogant little speech. I let him puff out his chest and play the role of the wealthy, successful doctor one last time. I absorbed every single insult without a single flinch because I knew what I was holding in my bag. Then I reached into my leather tote bag and pulled out a thick, heavy manila envelope. I walked over to the large glass vanity table in the corner of the room and dropped the envelope right in the center. The heavy thud echoed in the tense silence of the bridal suite. "If you are so incredibly wealthy and successful," Jamal, I said, my voice dangerously calm, "I want you to open this envelope. I want you to explain to your mother and your bride exactly what is inside." Jamal scoffed, rolling his eyes, but his gaze darted nervously toward the unmarked envelope. I am not playing your stupid games, Nicole, he muttered, taking a slight step back. I do not have to prove my bank accounts to a waitress. Fine, I said. I will explain it for everyone in the room. I opened the metal clasp and pulled out a thick stack of financial documents, spreading them aggressively across the glass vanity for everyone to see. There were bank statements, wire transfer receipts, and highly classified internal audit reports from the exact hospital where Jamal currently worked. Let us talk about your massive surgeon's salary, Jamal, I announced, tapping my finger sharply on the first highlighted document. Because according to these official bank records, you are completely broke. In fact, you are drowning in hundreds of thousands of dollars of debt. You have maxed out multiple high-interest credit cards to pay for your expensive tailored suits, your luxury car leases, and the lavish lifestyle you use to pretend you are a success. You are living exactly like your bankrupt father. Beatrice stepped forward, her eyes narrowing as she tried to read the tiny print on the documents. That is impossible, Beatrice argued, though her voice lacked its usual arrogant bite. My son is the youngest attending surgeon at his hospital. He receives massive research grants from national foundations. I looked directly at Beatrice, a cold smile forming on my lips. You are absolutely right, Beatrice. He does receive massive research grants, but he is not using them for medical research. I turned my attention back to Jamal, who had suddenly gone entirely pale. His confident posture completely collapsed, his shoulders slumping as he stared at the papers. He looked like he might actually pass out. You are not a brilliant doctor, Jamal, I stated, my voice slicing through the room like a scalpel. You are a thief. For the past 18 months, you have been systematically embezzling funds from the hospital's pediatric research department. You have been funneling hundreds of thousands of dollars of grant money into offshore shell accounts to pay off your personal debts and fund your flashy lifestyle. You stole money meant for sick children so you could buy designer watches and impress people at the country club. Sydney gasped, bringing both hands up to cover her mouth as she stared at the undeniable proof scattered across the vanity. The man she was supposed to marry in less than an hour was not just arrogant and cruel. He was a criminal hiding behind a white coat. Jamal shook his head violently, his eyes darting frantically between me and Sydney. No, Jamal stammered, his voice pitching high with sudden terror. That is not true. Those documents are forged. She printed them off the internet. Sydney, you cannot believe her. But the detailed hospital letterheads, the official routing numbers, and the precise transaction dates told a completely different story. The ironclad evidence was staring him right in the face, exposing the massive, fraudulent lie that was his entire existence. You do not understand how medical funding works, Jamal stammered, his voice cracking as he desperately tried to assemble a lie. He pointed a shaking finger at the bank statements scattered across the vanity. Those are administrative transfers. It is a common practice to reallocate grant money across different departmental accounts. You are misinterpreting complex financial data to make me look bad. I am a respected surgeon. I save lives every single day. I do not steal. Beatrice immediately latched onto her son's pathetic excuse. Exactly, she chimed in, though her voice lacked its usual sharp venom. She sounded frantic, clinging to the very last shred of her family's reputation. You are just a waitress, Nicole. You do not understand high-level hospital administration. My son is a brilliant doctor. These papers are just clerical adjustments. You are making an absolute fool of yourself by bringing this trash into the bridal suite. I did not argue with their desperate delusions. I simply reached back into the thick manila envelope and pulled out the second stack of documents. If it is just a clerical adjustment, Jamal, I said, my voice echoing coldly in the tense, silent room, then perhaps you can explain why the exact amount of money missing from the Pediatric Oncology Research Fund was wired directly to a luxury real estate brokerage in downtown Atlanta. Jamal stopped breathing. The last drop of color drained from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified ghost in a tailored tuxedo. I tossed a glossy 8 by 10 photograph onto the glass vanity right on top of the bank statements. It was a crystal clear, high-resolution image taken by a private investigator. It showed Jamal standing on the balcony of a stunning high-rise penthouse overlooking the city skyline. He was holding a glass of champagne, smiling brightly. Standing right next to him, wearing a designer silk robe with her arms wrapped intimately around his neck, was a beautiful young woman. "That is your medical assistant," Sydney whispered, stepping closer to the vanity. Her eyes were locked onto the photograph, her voice completely hollow and devoid of emotion. "That is the woman you told me was helping you organize your clinical trials." "She was helping him organize something," I replied, dropping a certified deed of trust onto the table. "She was helping him furnish the $850,000 luxury condo he bought for her last month, using the stolen hospital funds." I laid out the rest of the photographs. Images of Jamal and his mistress furniture shopping at an exclusive boutique. Images of them kissing outside a high-end jewelry store. Images of Jamal handing over a thick cashier's check to the real estate agent. The paper trail was absolutely flawless. The dates on the wire transfers matched the dates of his embezzlement, down to the exact hour. "You told me you were working late at the hospital," Sydney said, her body shaking violently as the reality of his double life crashed down on her. "You told me you were exhausted from saving patients. You made me feel guilty for asking for your time. But you were stealing money from sick children to buy a penthouse for your mistress." Beatrice stared at the photos of her son kissing his assistant. She collapsed onto the velvet sofa, burying her face in her hands. The pristine, flawless image of the Carter family was not just cracked, it was completely pulverized. Jamal looked at the deed of trust bearing his legal signature. He looked at the bank statements tracking the stolen cash. He realized instantly that his entire life was over. His medical license would be permanently revoked. He would face severe federal prison time for grand larceny and wire fraud. His elite status was gone forever. But instead of falling to his knees and begging Sydney for forgiveness, Jamal snapped. The fear in his eyes morphed into pure, unadulterated rage. He swept his arm violently across the glass vanity, knocking the photographs and bank statements onto the hardwood floor. "This is your fault," Jamal screamed, turning his furious glare toward the doorway, where his father had just been escorted away. His chest heaved as he lost complete control of his carefully crafted persona. "Do you have any idea what it is like being Reginald Carter's son? The absolute suffocating pressure of being expected to live like a billionaire when I am only a junior attending surgeon. He demanded I drive a luxury car. He demanded I wear custom suits. He told all his elite friends I was the highest earner in the hospital. He set an impossible financial standard and threatened to cut me off if I embarrassed him by living like a normal person." Jamal turned his manic, angry gaze back to Sydney, his face twisted in ugly resentment. "And then I met you," he spat, his voice dripping with cruelty. "A girl with absolutely nothing, no trust fund, no family money, no high society connections. My parents expected me to marry an heiress to fund their lavish lifestyle. Instead, I was stuck paying for everything. I had to maintain the image. I had to buy the expensive ring, the cars, the lifestyle. Where did you expect the money to come from, Sydney? I had to take it." He was a monster. Cornered, exposed, and lashing out at the very woman he had sworn to love, blaming everyone but his own greed. Jamal's heavy breathing filled the suffocating air as his vile words hung in the room. He stood there with his chest heaving, fully expecting Sydney to somehow absorb the blame for his own criminal behavior. But Sydney did not cry. The tears threatening to fall moments earlier vanished, replaced by a chilling, absolute clarity. She looked at Jamal, not with anger but with profound, hollow pity. "You stole to afford me," Sydney repeated, her voice eerily calm as she stripped away his pathetic defense. "I grew up wearing second-hand clothes and eating expired food. I drove a beat-up sedan through medical school and worked night shifts at the free clinic. I never asked you for a penthouse. I never asked you for a luxury lifestyle. You did not steal from me, Jamal. You stole because you are weak. You stole because you are exactly like your parents." You are a hollow shell of a person who values a zip code more than human decency. Jamal opened his mouth to argue, desperately wanting to reclaim control of the narrative, but Sydney held up her hand, silencing him instantly. She looked down at her left hand. The massive 3-carat diamond engagement ring sparkled brilliantly under the bridal suite chandeliers. It was the ring Beatrice had endlessly bragged about to her country club friends. The ring that was supposed to symbolize Sydney's social elevation. Now it just looked like a pair of expensive handcuffs bought with stolen pediatric funds. Sydney reached over with her right hand and slid the heavy diamond off her finger. She walked over to the small silver tray on the glass vanity where Jamal had left his half-full glass of champagne. She held the ring over the glass and let go. The heavy diamond hit the crystal with a sharp final clink, sinking straight to the bottom and coming to rest in the bubbling golden liquid. "There is no wedding today," Sydney announced with unshakable finality. "There is no wedding ever. I would rather scrub diner floors than be your wife. We are entirely done, Jamal." Jamal stared at the ring at the bottom of the glass, his mouth opening and closing in absolute shock. Beatrice, who had been sobbing quietly on the velvet sofa, let out a loud dramatic wail of absolute despair. Her perfect society wedding was officially dead. But the chaos in the room was far from over. From the hallway outside the open bridal suite doors, a loud commotion suddenly erupted. Gary and Brenda, who had been lurking just outside the doorway after slipping away earlier, shoved their way aggressively back into the room. They had been listening to every single word of the financial exposure. And if there was one thing my deadbeat parents fundamentally understood, it was the distinct smell of a sinking ship. Gary marched straight past me, completely ignoring his daughter, who had just canceled her wedding. He walked right up to Jamal and grabbed the lapels of his custom-tailored tuxedo. "I do not care about your little hospital embezzlement problem, kid," Gary barked aggressively, shaking the terrified, disgraced surgeon. "Your arrogant father promised me $10,000 cash to show up here today and play the loving dad. He said the Carters were rolling in money. Now I find out you are all a bunch of broke frauds. I want my money right now. You are wearing a $5,000 suit and a solid gold Rolex. Take it off or write me a check right this second." Brenda chimed in immediately, pointing her cheap acrylic nails directly at Beatrice. "You rich people think you can just hire us and then bounce the check. Pay us what you owe us, or I am going out to that ballroom right now and telling all your fancy doctor friends exactly how broke your entire family really is." Beatrice shrieked, swatting blindly at Gary's arms. "Get your filthy hands off my son, you disgusting street trash! We do not have your money." "Then I am taking the watch," Gary yelled, physically trying to unbuckle the heavy gold Rolex from Jamal's wrist as the disgraced surgeon desperately tried to push him away. The bridal suite instantly devolved into an absolute circus of screaming, shoving, and pathetic scrambling. The elite high society family and the trailer park deadbeats were finally fighting on the exact same level, tearing each other apart over a pile of lies and stolen money. It was a poetic and spectacular disaster. I stepped back from the brawl, placing a protective hand on Sydney's shoulder. She leaned into me, letting out a long, shuddering breath of profound relief. I pulled back the sleeve of my dress and checked my watch. It was exactly 10 minutes past noon. I looked out the large floor-to-ceiling windows facing the sprawling estate grounds. 300 of Atlanta's most elite medical professionals, wealthy investors, and high society socialites were currently seated in the grand ballroom, drinking top-shelf cocktails and eagerly waiting for a spectacular show. They had absolutely no idea the groom was a criminal and the wedding was canceled. I squeezed Sydney's shoulder gently. "Stay here," I told her, my voice cutting through the chaotic screaming of our parents physically fighting the Carters over a watch. "I have a wedding reception to address." I turned my back on the pathetic brawl unfolding in the bridal suite and walked out the heavy oak doors. I left Gary, Jamal, and Brenda fighting over a gold watch, like scavengers fighting over scraps of meat. I walked down the grand sweeping staircase of the estate, moving toward the main ballroom. The contrast between the violent chaos upstairs and the pristine elegance downstairs was absolutely jarring. A live string quartet was playing a soft classical melody, and waitstaff in crisp white tuxedos were circulating with trays of expensive champagne. The air smelled of fresh orchids and roasted expensive meats. 300 of Atlanta's most powerful and influential people were seated in the lavishly decorated room. There were chief medical officers, wealthy real estate investors, and high society matriarchs dripping in diamonds. They were all chatting politely, eagerly, awaiting the grand entrance of the Carter family and the beautiful bride. They expected a flawless display of wealth and status. I took a deep breath, smoothing the silk skirt of my $45,000 midnight blue haute couture gown. I pushed open the secondary doors and stepped into the ballroom alone. A few heads turned as I walked down the center aisle, but most people simply assumed I was a coordinator or a bridesmaid moving to take my place. I kept my posture completely straight, projecting nothing but absolute confidence. I walked past rows of towering floral arrangements that cost more than most people's cars and stepped directly onto the raised stage at the front of the room. The hired DJ, a young man in a sharp black suit, looked at me in confusion. He reached out to stop me, but I gave him a look so incredibly cold he instantly stepped back. I did not ask for his permission. I simply reached out and took the sleek wireless microphone right from its heavy metal stand. I tapped the top of the microphone twice. The sharp, thumping sound echoed through the massive state-of-the-art sound system, instantly cutting through the polite chatter of the crowd. The string quartet abruptly stopped playing, lowering their bows in confusion. 300 pairs of eyes shifted to the front of the room, locking directly onto me. The silence in the grand ballroom was sudden and absolute. You could hear a pin drop on the polished hardwood floor. "Good afternoon, everyone," I said, my voice steady and perfectly amplified across the massive space. "My name is Nicole. I am the older sister of the bride, Sydney. I know you are all waiting for a beautiful ceremony to begin, but I am afraid I have some highly unfortunate news. There will be no wedding today. The ceremony is officially canceled." A collective gasp rippled through the massive sea of elite guests. People shifted uncomfortably in their velvet-covered chairs, exchanging confused and deeply concerned whispers. A few of the hospital board members in the front row frowned heavily, clearly unaccustomed to things not going exactly according to plan. Beatrice had spent months bragging about this flawless union, and now it was falling apart before their very eyes. I did not give them time to speculate. I wanted the absolute truth out in the open before the Carter family could spin their own toxic narrative. My sister recently discovered some irreconcilable truths about her fiancé, Jamal Carter. I continued, making sure every single syllable was crystal clear. She learned that Jamal has been living a completely fraudulent double life. He is currently drowning in massive personal debt. But worse than that, he has spent the last 18 months actively embezzling hundreds of thousands of dollars from his hospital's pediatric oncology research fund. He used that stolen money to purchase a luxury penthouse downtown for his medical assistant, who is also his long-term mistress. The reaction was instantaneous and explosive. The polite confusion in the room morphed into sheer, absolute horror. Several wealthy women let out loud, shocked gasps, physically covering their mouths with their hands. The hospital executives sitting in the VIP section jumped out of their seats, their faces turning pale as the reality of a massive public relations and legal disaster hit them. The room erupted into a chaotic symphony of outraged whispers and frantic shouting. The flawless, prestigious image of the Carter family was being publicly slaughtered in front of their most important peers. Just as the noise in the room reached a fever pitch, the main double doors at the back of the ballroom burst open with a violent crash. Reginald and Beatrice Carter, who had apparently managed to slip away from the police officers outside the venue, came sprinting into the room. Reginald looked completely unhinged, his custom morning suit jacket flying open, his face contorted into an ugly mask of pure rage. Beatrice trailed right behind him, sobbing hysterically and pointing a shaking finger toward the stage. Cut that microphone, Reginald screamed at the top of his lungs, his booming voice competing with the chaotic murmur of the crowd. He sprinted down the center aisle, shoving his way past his wealthy friends and colleagues without an ounce of grace. He knocked over a crystal vase, sending water and orchids crashing to the floor. "Turn it off right now. She is a psychotic liar. Do not listen to a single word she says. DJ, cut the sound or I will ruin you." The DJ immediately stepped away from his soundboard, raising his hands in surrender as Reginald stormed the booth. Reginald did not even wait for the DJ to hand him a microphone. He reached over the electronic equipment, aggressively yanking a backup wireless mic from its charging cradle. The sudden movement caused a harsh screech of feedback to echo through the ballroom, making several guests wince and cover their ears. Reginald ignored the terrible sound. He gripped the microphone so tightly his knuckles turned completely white and marched to the center of the dance floor, positioning himself right below the stage where I was standing. He turned his back to me, completely ignoring my presence, and faced the sea of confused faces. He zeroed in on the front rows where the chief medical officers and major investors of his hospital were seated. He forced a wide, unnatural smile onto his face, attempting to mask his sheer panic with his usual brand of arrogant charm. "Ladies and gentlemen," Reginald began, his booming voice shaking slightly despite his best efforts to control it. "I sincerely apologize for this incredibly tasteless interruption. Please remain seated and do not pay any attention to the absurd fairy tales you just heard. The woman standing on that stage is not a credible source of information. She is a deeply disturbed and mentally unstable individual who has been completely estranged from her own family for years. She has a long documented history of psychological issues and pathological lying." A heavy murmur spread through the crowd. Reginald paced back and forth, holding his free hand up to placate his wealthy peers. He locked eyes with a senior hospital board member, an older gentleman who had recently approved a massive grant for Jamal's department. Reginald offered the man a patronizing chuckle, shaking his head as if the entire situation was just a silly misunderstanding. "You all know my son Jamal." Reginald continued, his voice dripping with fake sincerity. "You know he is one of the most dedicated and brilliant surgical residents in this entire state. He is the pride of the Carter family and a pillar of the medical community. The idea that he would steal a single cent, let alone embezzle from pediatric research, is not only wildly offensive, but entirely laughable. My son saves the lives of children. He does not steal from them." Beatrice stood at the edge of the dance floor, dabbing her dry eyes with a silk handkerchief, playing the role of the distressed but dignified matriarch perfectly. She nodded along as her husband spun his desperate web of lies, leaning on the arm of a wealthy socialite for dramatic support. Reginald pointed a heavy finger back at me without turning around. "This woman is simply jealous," he declared, his tone turning incredibly venomous. "She is an unmarried broke waitress who has spent her entire pathetic life working in greasy diners and living in squalor. She has absolutely no education, no career, and no prospects. She saw her younger sister marrying into a family of our incredible stature, and her jealousy drove her to absolute madness. She cannot stand the fact that Sydney is getting the social elevation of a lifetime while she remains nothing but bottom-feeding trash." The crowd remained silent, but a few of the older socialites nodded sympathetically toward Beatrice, clearly buying into the narrative of the bitter, jealous spinster sister. They were eager to protect their own social circles from outsiders. Reginald saw this slight shift in the room and leaned into his lie with even more aggressive confidence. "Those documents she claims to have are nothing more than cheap internet forgeries." Reginald sneered, projecting his voice to reach the very back of the massive room. "Anyone with a basic computer can print out fake bank statements and Photoshop a picture of a condo. She is trying to extort our family for money. She threatened us in the bridal suite, demanding a massive cash payout to keep her fabricated delusions quiet. When we absolutely refused to negotiate with a deranged terrorist, she decided to come out here and throw this pathetic temper tantrum to ruin my son's special day." Reginald took a step closer to the VIP tables, spreading his arms wide in a grand, sweeping gesture of reassurance. I assure you all the Carter family finances are completely pristine. We are paying for this entire magnificent $300,000 weekend out of our own pockets. My private surgical clinic is expanding rapidly, and our investments have never been stronger. We are the exact same reliable, wealthy family you have known and trusted for decades. Do not let this uneducated garbage manipulate you into doubting my legacy. He finally turned around and glared up at me, his face flushed with dark triumph. He truly believed he had saved his reputation. He thought his smooth talking and elite connections were enough to sweep the ugly truth under the rug. He pointed right at my face, his expression twisting into a sneer of absolute disgust. Security Reginald barked into the microphone, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. I want this psychotic lying trash removed from my privately funded event immediately. Throw her out onto the street and call the police. She is trespassing, and I will be pressing full charges for defamation and extortion. You are finished, Nicole. Your little game is over. I stood completely still on the raised stage looking down at him. I did not interrupt his frantic, desperate speech. I let him dig his grave as deep as humanly possible. I wanted every single one of his elite colleagues to hear him claim full ownership of this event and brag about his pristine financial status. Because the trap I had set was finally ready to snap shut. Reginald stood on the dance floor panting heavily, looking incredibly proud of his little speech. He truly believed he had gaslit 300 of the smartest people in Atlanta. He waited for security guards to rush in and drag me away. He waited for the crowd to applaud his authoritative handling of the situation. Instead, I just smiled. It was a cold, calculated smile that made his smug expression falter. I did not yell back at him. I did not try to defend my education or my career history to a room full of strangers. I reached into the hidden pocket of my blue gown and pulled out a small black remote control. I aimed it at the tech booth and pressed a single button. Instantly, the massive LED screens behind the stage flared to life. The sudden bright light bathed the ballroom in a stark white glow, causing several guests to rapidly squint. A massive, high-resolution document appeared on the screens, looming 30 feet tall right over my head. It was not a forged bank statement. It was not a blurry photograph. It was a dense, legally binding commercial real estate contract bearing the official watermarks of the state of Georgia. I raised the wireless microphone back to my lips. My voice echoed with absolute authority, completely shattering Reginald's pathetic illusion of control. Since Dr. Reginald Carter wants to talk about pristine finances and expanding his private surgical clinic, I figured we should look at his actual business operations, I announced. What you are all looking at on the screens behind me is the master commercial lease agreement for the Carter Premium Surgery Center, located in the prestigious downtown medical district. Reginald turned around to look at the massive screens. The blood instantly drained from his face, leaving him looking completely hollow. He recognized the document immediately. He recognized his own signature at the bottom of the page. As many of the hospital board members in this room know, I continued locking eyes with the wealthy investors sitting in the front row. The Carter Premium Surgery Center does not own its building. They lease the property from an anonymous corporate landlord known as Apex Healthcare Properties. Apex is a multi-million-dollar real estate trust that specializes in acquiring and managing premium medical facilities across the entire East Coast. Beatrice grabbed her husband's arm, her manicured fingers digging into his expensive suit jacket. Reginald, what is she doing? Beatrice whispered loudly, her voice trembling with rising panic. Make her turn that off. Reginald could not move. He was completely paralyzed, staring up at the massive contract that dictated his entire professional livelihood. For the past 6 months, Dr. Carter has been aggressively begging the corporate board of Apex Healthcare Properties for a lease extension, I said, pacing slowly across the stage. He has sent dozens of emails pleading for lower rent and a longer repayment window because his clinic is secretly bleeding cash. He has been entirely at the mercy of a faceless corporate entity, hoping they would not notice his catastrophic financial decline. I stopped pacing and looked directly down at Reginald. The arrogant surgeon looked incredibly small standing on the dance floor. "Well, Reginald," I said, my voice dropping to a deadly serious tone, "you no longer have to beg a faceless corporate entity. You can beg me directly. Because I am not a broke, uneducated waitress. I am the founder and the chief executive officer of Apex Healthcare Properties. I am the anonymous landlord, miss. I own the building your clinic operates in, and I own the land it sits on." A collective gasp of absolute shock ripped through the ballroom. The wealthy investors in the front row literally dropped their jaws in disbelief. The woman Reginald had just publicly dismissed as bottom-feeding trash was actually the real estate mogul controlling his entire professional empire. "You called me a parasite, Reginald," I reminded him, my voice echoing relentlessly. "You said I was a charity case, but the truth is your entire medical legacy exists solely because I allowed you to rent space in my building, and unfortunately for you, that arrangement ends today." I pointed to the highlighted section of the contract glowing brightly on the LED screens. "As clearly stated in Section 4 of your commercial agreement, your current lease expires tonight at exactly midnight," I announced loudly, ensuring every single investor and peer heard the final nail going into his coffin. "I am officially denying your request for a renewal. Your contract is terminated. You have exactly 30 days to vacate my property and remove all your medical equipment. If you are not gone by the 1st of the month, I will have my legal team seize your assets and lock the doors." The silence following my declaration shattered into a deafening roar. The ballroom erupted into total chaos. The LED screens behind me continued to project the undeniable legal proof of Reginald's impending bankruptcy, casting a harsh white light over his horrified face. He stood completely frozen on the dance floor, his mouth opening and closing silently as he stared at his own signature on the termination clause. He had built his entire arrogant persona on the illusion of ownership, and in a matter of seconds, that illusion was entirely incinerated. The crowd of elite guests began talking over one another, creating a chaotic symphony of outrage. The most devastating reaction did not come from the gossiping crowd. It came from the front row of the VIP section. 3 prominent older men, dressed in immaculate tailored suits, stood up simultaneously. These were the major hospital board members and the primary financial backers of the Carter Premium Surgery Center. For months, Reginald had been soliciting massive capital investments from them, explicitly claiming he owned the downtown medical building outright. He had leveraged the physical real estate as collateral to secure their funding. Seeing the commercial lease projected on the wall proved he committed massive financial fraud. The lead investor, a stern man named Dr. Thomas Kensington, did not bother lowering his voice. He marched directly onto the dance floor, confronting Reginald with undisguised fury. "You lied to us!" Reginald, Dr. Kensington barked, pointing a sharp finger at the arrogant surgeon's chest. "You sat in my office last week and looked me directly in the eye and swore you held the deed to that property. You used fake real estate equity to secure a $2 million expansion loan from our investment group. You do not own a single brick of that building. You are a tenant facing an active eviction." Reginald scrambled desperately, trying to salvage the rapidly disintegrating situation. He held his shaking hands up in a pathetic, pleading gesture, entirely abandoning his previous authoritative bravado. "Wait, Thomas, please listen to me," Reginald begged, his voice cracking with sheer panic. "It is just a temporary cash flow issue. I can restructure the equity immediately. We can move the clinic to another premium location. Do not let this crazy woman manipulate our lucrative business partnership. The surgical clinic is highly profitable, I swear to you. We just need a little more time to finalize the blueprints. Please do not walk away from decades of friendship over a simple misunderstanding." Dr. Kensington let out a harsh, disgusted laugh. Profitable? Dr. Kensington spat, his face turning red with anger. "Your own son was just exposed for embezzling pediatric research grants to buy a penthouse for his mistress. Your entire family is drowning in debt and criminal liability. I am not letting my capital go down with your sinking ship," We are completely done, Reginald. I am pulling my investment funds effective immediately. My lawyers will be contacting you in the morning to demand a full return of our capital. If that money is missing, we will see you in court. The other two investors nodded in firm agreement, turning their backs on Reginald and walking briskly toward the exit. They did not even stay to finish their expensive cocktails. Their abrupt departure was the ultimate signal to the rest of the elite crowd. The Carter family was officially toxic. The wealthy socialites and medical professionals immediately began whispering frantically, pulling out their phones to text their colleagues about the massive scandal unfolding before their eyes. Beatrice watched the wealthy investors walk away, and the horrifying reality of her new life finally hit her. The exclusive country club memberships, the least imported luxury cars, the high society gala invitations were all permanently gone. She let out a loud, hysterical sob, her knees buckling beneath her. She physically collapsed into a velvet dining chair at the edge of the dance floor. She buried her face in her hands, crying uncontrollably, as her perfect social standing disintegrated in real time. The elite women she had spent years trying to impress did not rush over to comfort her. Instead, they physically backed away, gathering their expensive designer purses and casting looks of absolute disgust in her direction. Beatrice was completely isolated, drowning in the public humiliation she had tried so fiercely to inflict on me and my sister. I stood silently on the stage, watching the absolute destruction of the people who thought they could abuse my family. Reginald was left standing entirely alone on the dance floor, his shoulders slumped, his completely destroyed career. He looked up at me, his eyes filled with terrified defeat. He finally realized that insulting the broke waitress was the absolute worst mistake he could have ever made in his entire miserable life. The heavy silence in the room was suddenly broken by the sound of the secondary ballroom doors opening. Everyone turned to look. It was not the catering staff bringing out the appetizers. It was Sydney. She had taken off her white silk bridal robe and was now wearing a simple pair of jeans and a dark sweater. Her face was completely washed clean of the heavy bridal makeup. She looked incredibly calm and completely free. She walked into the massive ballroom carrying a small overnight bag, completely ignoring the hundreds of staring guests and the chaotic whispers echoing around her. Jamal had followed her downstairs. He burst through the doors right behind her, still wearing his custom tuxedo, looking like an absolute madman. He saw the LED screens projecting his father's eviction notice. He saw the wealthy investors walking out. He realized his entire world was collapsing, and his only lifeline was the woman he had treated like garbage. "Sydney, please wait!" Jamal screamed, sprinting across the polished hardwood floor. He lunged toward the stage, desperately trying to grab her arm before she could reach me. "I can explain everything. The condo was a mistake. The embezzlement was just a temporary loan to myself. I will pay it back. We can still get married. We can leave Atlanta and start over somewhere else. You cannot just abandon me like this." Sydney stopped walking. She turned to face the man she almost married. 300 of the most powerful people in the city held their collective breath, waiting for her response. Sydney did not yell. She did not cry. She simply looked Jamal up and down with an expression of pure, unadulterated pity. "I am not abandoning you, Jamal," Sydney said, her voice echoing clearly across the dead silent room. "I am surviving you. Enjoy your federal prison sentence." She turned her back on him and walked up the short flight of stairs to stand right beside me on the stage. Jamal let out a guttural scream of pure frustration. He rushed the stage, attempting to climb the stairs and force his way up to us. He was completely out of his mind with desperation. That was the exact moment I raised my hand and signaled the venue's security. The head coordinator marched into the ballroom, followed immediately by the two uniformed police officers who had served Reginald the restraining order upstairs. A team of 6 massive private security guards wearing dark suits flanked them. They moved with absolute military precision, completely surrounding the stage and blocking Jamal's path. Reginald suddenly snapped out of his terrified trance. He saw the police officers and his delusional arrogance flared up one final time. "Officers, arrest this woman!" Reginald bellowed, pointing a shaking finger at me from the dance floor. "She is projecting my private commercial documents. She is trespassing on my privately funded event. I demand you remove her and secure this ballroom for my family right now." The lead police officer stopped walking. He looked at Reginald with an expression of absolute profound exhaustion. The officer pulled out a thick clipboard holding the master contract for the entire estate weekend. Dr. Carter, the police officer, announced, his deep, authoritative voice carrying effortlessly across the massive room. "We have already had this conversation upstairs. We have verified the financial records with the estate management and the corporate banking representatives. You have not paid a single cent for this venue, the catering, or the security. You are not the host of this event." The officer turned and gestured respectfully up toward me. "The woman standing on that stage paid the $300,000 invoice in full via a certified corporate wire transfer from Apex Healthcare Properties. She is the sole legal owner of this event and this space. And she has formally requested that you, your wife, and your son be permanently removed from the premises for trespassing and disturbing the peace." Reginald opened his mouth to argue, but no words came out. Beatrice let out another hysterical wail from her chair. Jamal fell to his knees on the hardwood floor, burying his face in his hands as the reality of his total destruction finally crushed him. "Escort them out," I commanded, speaking directly into the microphone so every single person in the room could hear me. "And if they resist, you have my full authorization to press criminal charges." The private security guards immediately moved in. Two massive men grabbed Reginald by the arms, hauling the disgraced surgeon toward the main exit. Two others flanked Beatrice, forcing her to stand up and walk. The police officers pulled Jamal off the floor, marching the crying embezzler right out of the ballroom. As the Carter family was forcefully paraded down the center aisle, the true magnitude of their public downfall was cemented. All around the ballroom, the elite guests, the wealthy investors, and the high society socialites pulled out their smartphones. Hundreds of camera flashes went off, illuminating the room. Dozens of people began recording the pathetic, humiliating walk of shame. Beatrice tried to cover her face with her designer handbag, weeping, as her own friends filmed her expulsion. Reginald kept his head down, utterly defeated by the viral scandal he could never erase. The Carters had spent their entire lives obsessing over their perfect public image, and now their absolute worst nightmare was being broadcast in high definition across the internet. I stood on the stage holding my sister's hand, watching the monsters who tried to break us get thrown out like the trash they truly were. The heavy mahogany doors slammed shut behind the disgraced Carter family, cutting off Beatrice's hysterical wails. The grand ballroom was left in a state of electrified shock. Guests were whispering furiously, their phones still gripped in their hands. I turned to Sydney and gave her hand a reassuring squeeze. She gave me a small, genuine smile, the weight of the toxic relationship finally lifted from her shoulders. But the cleanup was not entirely finished. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw two incredibly out-of-place figures pushing their way through the crowd of wealthy socialites. It was Gary and Brenda. My deadbeat parents had slinked downstairs after the brawl in the bridal suite drawn by the commotion. Now they were staring up at the massive LED screens, still projecting my corporate real estate documents. The realization had finally hit their greedy minds. The daughter they abandoned was a multi-millionaire. Gary practically sprinted up the stage stairs, his cheap rented tuxedo bunching at the shoulders. His face was split into a massive, sickeningly sweet grin that I had not seen since I was a child. Brenda followed closely behind him, clasping her hands over her heart and forcing fake tears into her eyes. "Nicole, sweetheart," Gary exclaimed, his voice dripping with forced paternal warmth. He reached out with both arms, attempting to pull me into a tight embrace. "We are so incredibly proud of you. Look at what you have built. We always knew you had a brilliant mind for business. You are a true inspiration to this family." I took a sharp step backward, completely avoiding his touch. His empty arms fell awkwardly to his sides. "Oh, my beautiful girls," Brenda chimed in, wiping a non-existent tear from her cheek. "We were just so confused upstairs. That terrible doctor manipulated us. But seeing you two standing here so strong and successful makes my heart soar. We are your parents, Nicole. We want to be part of your life again. We can finally be the family we were always meant to be." I looked at the two strangers standing in front of me. They did not see their daughters. They saw a walking bank account. They saw a golden ticket out of their miserable, impoverished lives. "You want to be a family now?" I asked, my voice dangerously soft. "Right after you explicitly told Sydney that you only came here because Reginald promised you $10,000. Gary chuckled nervously, waving his hand as if brushing away a minor misunderstanding. "That was just a business transaction, Nicole. We had to do what we had to do to survive. But blood is thicker than water. We are your parents. You owe us the respect of a second chance. With your resources, we could really turn things around. We could work for your company." I let out a harsh, humorless laugh that echoed through the microphone. "You sold your parental rights 12 years ago when you abandoned a 14-year-old girl in a foreclosed house with no electricity," I said, my voice rising in volume. "And today, you tried to sell those non-existent rights again to an arrogant surgeon for $10,000 in cash. You do not care about Sydney, and you certainly do not care about me. The only thing you care about is the fact that I own the building Reginald Carter is about to get evicted from." Brenda dropped her fake smile, her eyes narrowing with greedy desperation. "You have millions of dollars, Nicole." She snapped, her true colors instantly bleeding through. "You can afford to take care of your own mother and father. It is your legal and moral duty. You cannot just leave us with nothing while you wear a $45,000 dress." "Watch me," I replied coldly. I raised my hand and signaled the private security team who had just returned from escorting the Carters out. The massive guards immediately marched toward the stage. "These two are not on the guest list," I instructed the guards. "And do not give them the dignity of the front entrance. Escort them through the kitchen and throw them out the loading dock. If they ever step foot on any property owned by my company, have them arrested for trespassing." Gary's face turned bright red with fury. "You ungrateful brat," he screamed as two guards grabbed him by the arms. "We gave you life. You owe us everything." The guards dragged Gary and Brenda off the stage and pulled them across the ballroom. Brenda shrieked and kicked, her cheap sequined dress flashing under the chandeliers as they hauled her through the swinging kitchen doors. Their screams faded into the back corridors, leaving the grand ballroom in perfect peace. I turned back to face the 300 elite guests. They were staring at me in absolute stunned silence. I tapped the microphone one last time. "Ladies and gentlemen," I announced, a warm, genuine smile finally crossing my face. "The wedding is officially canceled. However, the $300,000 reception has been paid in full. We have a 5-course Wagyu beef dinner, top-shelf champagne, and imported caviar waiting in the dining hall. I invite you all to stay, eat, drink, and celebrate the fact that my sister just dodged a massive criminal bullet." For a second, nobody moved. Then Dr. Kensington, the wealthy investor who had just pulled his funding from Reginald, stood up and started clapping. Within seconds, the entire ballroom erupted into massive cheering and applause. The tension completely evaporated. I signaled the DJ, and upbeat celebratory music instantly filled the room. Sydney let out a breath she had been holding for months. She grabbed a glass of champagne from a passing waiter and raised it high in the air. The crowd roared in response, raising their own glasses to join her toast. The nightmare was truly over. The music pulsed through the grand ballroom, a vibrant celebration replacing the suffocating tension that had gripped the estate all morning. Waiters expertly navigated the crowd with trays of gourmet appetizers, and the wealthy guests mingled with a renewed, relaxed energy. I watched Sydney laugh as a prominent hospital board member clinked his glass against hers, congratulating her on an incredibly lucky escape. But beneath her bright smile, I could see the sheer exhaustion settling into her eyes. The adrenaline that had carried her through the explosive confrontation was finally beginning to crash. I stepped up to her side and gently touched her arm. "Let us get some air," I suggested, leaning in close so she could hear me over the upbeat music. Sydney nodded gratefully, handing her empty champagne flute to a passing waiter. We slipped through a set of heavy glass doors, escaping the loud, chaotic joy of the reception and stepping out onto the sprawling stone terrace. The cool evening air washed over us instantly. The terrace overlooked the manicured estate gardens illuminated by soft golden string lights. It was incredibly quiet out here, perfectly insulated from the party inside. As soon as the heavy glass doors clicked shut behind us, Sydney's brave facade completely crumbled. Her shoulders slumped, and she covered her face with both hands. A raw, heavy sob tore from her chest. I stepped forward immediately, wrapping my arms tightly around her. She leaned her head against my shoulder, crying not for the loss of Jamal, but for the massive emotional toll of the entire horrific ordeal. "I am so sorry," Nicole Sydney whispered, her voice shaking uncontrollably as she gripped the fabric of my dress. "I am so incredibly sorry." I rubbed her back, keeping my hold firm and protective. "You have absolutely nothing to apologize for, Sydney," I said softly. "Yes, I do," she insisted, pulling back slightly to look at me. Her eyes were red and filled with profound guilt. "I let them treat you like garbage. I sat there at the rehearsal dinner and let Beatrice insult you. I let Jamal gaslight me into thinking I owed them my silence. I wanted that perfect family illusion so badly. I wanted to erase our past and feel like I belonged in high society. I was so desperate for a respectable last name that I completely ignored the monsters I was dealing with. I almost traded my soul and your dignity just to wear a fancy ring." I reached up and gently wiped a tear from her cheek. "You were looking for safety, Sydney," I replied, my tone sharp but filled with deep, unwavering empathy. "When you grow up with nothing, when the people who are supposed to protect you leave you in an empty house to starve, you spend the rest of your life searching for security. Jamal looked like security. His family looked like stability. You did not fall in love with a criminal. You fell in love with a mirage, and the moment you saw the truth, you walked away. That takes incredible strength." Sydney took a deep, shuddering breath, looking out over the dark gardens. "I was just so afraid of ending up like our parents," she admitted softly. "I thought if I married into the Carter family, I would finally be somebody. I would finally be safe from the poverty we grew up in." "You are already somebody," I told her, gripping her shoulders and forcing her to look directly into my eyes. "You did not need Jamal's last name to elevate you. You earned your medical degree with your own brilliant mind and your own relentless hard work. You save lives every single day. The Carters needed you to legitimize their fake image. You never needed them. We built our own family, Sydney. We survived the worst hands life could deal us, and we built an empire from the ground up. You are a doctor, and I am a CEO. We are the elite. And we did it without stepping on a single person to get here." Sydney stared at me, the heavy guilt in her eyes slowly dissolving into a fierce, burning clarity. She wiped the last remaining tears from her face and stood up straighter. "You worked 14-hour diner shifts so I could hold a scalpel," she said, her voice growing stronger with every word. "You gave up your youth to make sure I had a future. You are my family, Nicole. You are the only family I will ever need." I smiled, feeling a profound sense of peace settle over my heart. "We are our own chosen family," I agreed. Sydney looked down at her left hand where the heavy diamond ring used to be. The skin was bare and free. "I swear to you, Nicole," she said, her tone ringing with absolute, unshakable resolve, "I will never let a man or a fancy title dictate my worth ever again. I will never shrink myself to fit into a room where I am not respected. From now on, I build my own table." I linked my arm through hers. "Come on, Dr. Sydney," I said, nodding toward the glass doors leading back into the bright, loud ballroom. "We have a $300,000 party to attend, and I believe they are serving the Wagyu beef." Sydney laughed, a genuine bright sound that echoed beautifully in the cool night air. We walked back into the reception not as broken orphans, but as two fiercely independent women who had just conquered the world. Exactly 6 months have passed since that unforgettable night at the estate. The seasons changed in Atlanta, and so did the entire social hierarchy of the medical community. The Carter family, who once sat comfortably at the absolute pinnacle of that society, experienced a downfall so spectacular it became a cautionary tale whispered in hospital corridors and corporate boardrooms. They learned the hard way that when you build an empire entirely on lies and arrogance, gravity is incredibly unforgiving. I strictly kept my word regarding the commercial lease. Exactly 30 days after the canceled wedding, my legal team arrived at the Carter Premium Surgery Center, accompanied by local law enforcement and a commercial moving crew. Reginald had desperately tried to file emergency injunctions and delay the eviction, but his total lack of liquid funds made it impossible to secure competent legal representation. I stood across the street sipping a coffee as the movers dismantled the giant illuminated sign bearing his name. Furthermore, Dr. Kensington and the other major investors made good on their promises. They aggressively sued Reginald for financial fraud, completely freezing his remaining personal assets. Watching the expensive medical equipment being wheeled out of my building was a quiet, satisfying victory. Reginald was forced to formally declare Chapter 7, bankruptcy. His private clinic, the crown jewel of his massive ego, was permanently dissolved. Without his elite surgical center, and completely blacklisted by his former investors, he could no longer practice in any reputable hospital in Atlanta. He was reduced to begging for basic consulting shifts at low-tier urgent care facilities far outside the city limits. The arrogant man who once aggressively demanded I be thrown into the street was now struggling to pay rent for a tiny strip mall office. Jamal's fate was even more severe. The morning after the wedding, I ensured the thick manila envelope of financial documents was delivered directly to the hospital's board of directors and the state medical licensing board. A massive internal audit was launched immediately. Federal investigators meticulously traced every single stolen dollar from the pediatric oncology research grants directly to the downtown luxury penthouse and the offshore shell accounts. The professional fallout was swift and entirely merciless. The medical board permanently revoked Jamal's medical license, stripping him of the prestigious career he constantly used to belittle others. But losing his title was only the beginning of his nightmare. Federal prosecutors officially indicted him on multiple felony counts of wire fraud and grand larceny. He tried to play the victim during his hearing, blaming the intense pressure of his family legacy, but the judge showed absolutely no sympathy for a doctor who stole from sick children. The $850,000 luxury penthouse he bought for his mistress was quickly seized by the government to pay back the stolen hospital funds. Predictably, his mistress abandoned him the very second the bank accounts were frozen, leaving him entirely alone to face the consequences. Jamal recently pleaded guilty to avoid a highly publicized trial. He is currently sitting in a federal holding facility, awaiting a mandatory prison sentence. He traded his custom-tailored tuxedos and solid gold Rolex for a standard-issue orange jumpsuit. And then there was Beatrice. Her entire identity, her entire sense of self-worth was wrapped up in her perceived social superiority. When the devastating financial collapse hit her, high society friends vanished overnight. The elite women who once drank champagne with her completely cut all ties, refusing to be associated with a family of exposed criminals. The exclusive country clubs in Atlanta immediately revoked her memberships, citing the thousands of dollars in unpaid dues and the massive public scandal she brought to their doors. The leased luxury Mercedes was repossessed right out of her driveway in broad daylight. She was forced to sell her extensive designer wardrobe and move into a cramped two-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of town. She no longer had a wealthy husband to fund her arrogance or a successful son to brag about at luncheons. The pristine bubble of privilege popped, leaving her to face the cold, harsh reality of the real world without a single friend to lean on. I heard from a mutual acquaintance that Beatrice now spends her days avoiding eye contact at the local discount grocery store. She wears oversized sunglasses and pulls her coat tight, trying to hide her face from the exact same working-class people she used to treat like absolute garbage. Her absolute worst nightmare had finally become her permanent reality. She was finally the impoverished, invisible nobody she had always aggressively accused me of being. Every day she wakes up in that tiny apartment, she is forced to remember that her cruelty cost her everything she ever valued in this life. While the Carters spent the last 6 months watching their fraudulent empire crumble into dust, Sydney and I spent that exact same time building something real. The contrast between our two families could not have been more poetic. Reginald and Jamal had used medicine as a weapon to inflate their fragile egos and steal from the vulnerable. They viewed their patients as nothing more than stepping stones to luxury car leases and exclusive country club memberships. Sydney viewed medicine as a profound calling. She wanted to heal the very people the Carters had spent their entire pathetic lives ignoring. Today, the warm Atlanta sun was shining brightly on the gleaming glass facade of a brand-new medical building located right in the heart of the city. It was a beautiful state-of-the-art facility with wide, welcoming double doors and bright, spacious waiting rooms painted in calming colors. But this building was not leased to a corrupt surgeon charging exorbitant hidden fees. This prime property was the newest acquisition of Apex Healthcare Properties, and I was handing the master keys directly to my sister. Sydney stood next to me on the pristine concrete walkway, wearing a sharp, tailored white lab coat over a stunning emerald green dress. She looked absolutely radiant. The exhaustion and deep fear that had haunted her eyes 6 months ago were completely gone. In their place was a fierce, undeniable confidence. She was no longer the terrified medical resident desperate for a wealthy, toxic family to validate her existence. She was Dr. Sydney, lead physician and founder of the Hope City Women's Clinic. When Sydney first pitched the idea to me months ago, she had a thick binder full of meticulous business plans and daunting loan applications. She was fully prepared to fight tooth and nail for every single dollar of commercial funding to open a clinic dedicated to providing free and low-cost maternal care for under-resourced women. I let her finish her entire passionate pitch before I took the binder right out of her hands and dropped it in the trash. I told her she would not be taking out a single bank loan. I placed her clinic in the most premium commercial space my real estate trust owned. I drew up an ironclad lease agreement that charged her exactly $1 a year for the next 50 years. Furthermore, my corporate philanthropy division covered the entire cost of the cutting-edge medical equipment, the advanced ultrasound machines, and the pediatric exam tables. I did not do it just because she was my sister. I did it because it was the ultimate poetic justice against the toxic greed we had just defeated. The money Jamal stole from pediatric research had been recovered by federal agents, but the damage to the community trust was severe. Sydney's clinic was the perfect antidote. She was going to provide world-class elite healthcare to the exact same struggling working-class families that Beatrice Carter used to mercilessly mock. A massive, joyful crowd was gathered in front of the clinic for the official grand opening. There were no fake high society socialites wearing dripping diamonds. There were no arrogant hospital executives looking for a shallow photo opportunity. The crowd was made up of genuine community leaders, local nurses, fellow residents who had stood loyally by Sydney, and the everyday families who would actually benefit from the facility. The energy in the air was electric and purely positive. A thick red velvet ribbon was stretched tightly across the front entrance. I handed Sydney a pair of oversized silver ceremonial scissors. She took them in her hands, running her thumb over the cool metal. She looked at the modern building bearing her name in bold silver letters, and then she turned to look at me. Her eyes were shining with unshed tears, but this time they were tears of absolute triumph. "I cannot believe we are actually standing here," Sydney whispered, her voice thick with raw emotion. 6 months ago, I thought my life was completely over. I thought I was going to be trapped in a miserable fake marriage, paying off a criminal's debts and scrubbing floors just to survive. Now I own my own medical practice. I am going to help so many young women who grew up just like we did. You earned every single piece of this reality, Sydney, I replied, keeping my voice steady and fiercely proud. You survived the deadbeats who abandoned us. You survived the monsters who tried to break your spirit. You never compromised your good heart. This clinic represents exactly who you are. She smiled, a bright, genuine expression that could have lit up the entire city block. She turned back to the eager crowd, raising the heavy silver scissors high in the air. The community members let out a massive cheer, clapping their hands and whistling loudly. Sydney positioned the sharp blades right over the center of the red velvet ribbon. This is for the women who were told they were not enough, Sydney announced, her voice carrying beautifully over the cheering crowd. This is for the girls who had to build their own tables. She squeezed the handles together, slicing cleanly through the thick red ribbon. The two halves fell away, fluttering down to the concrete walkway. The crowd erupted into deafening applause. I put my arm around my sister's shoulders, pulling her into a tight, proud embrace as the doors to her brand new future finally opened wide. We had walked through absolute fire to get here, but standing in the bright sunlight of her success, I knew we had finally won the war. I stepped back from the cheering crowd and let the warm Atlanta breeze wash over me. I looked up at the massive illuminated sign mounted above the sleek glass doors. Hope City Women's Clinic. The bold silver lettering stood as a permanent ironclad monument to everything my sister had endured and overcome. It was not a fake leased property leveraged on stolen equity and predatory high-interest loans. It was real. It was ours. And it was going to change thousands of lives every single year. As I stood there watching Sydney hug her new head nurse, my mind drifted back to that suffocating private dining room at the luxury restaurant exactly 6 months ago. I remembered the heavy scent of Beatrice Carter's expensive perfume and the sickening smugness on Reginald's face. I remembered the dark red wine blooming across Sydney's beautiful silk dress and the pathetic, cowardly way Jamal grabbed her arm, demanding she apologize to the monsters actively abusing her. They were so incredibly certain of their untouchable superiority. They looked at a woman who had worked double shifts to buy her sister college textbooks, and they saw absolutely nothing but a target. Beatrice had looked me dead in the eye and called me a broke, uneducated waitress. She called me an annoying freeloader trying to leech off their generational wealth. Reginald had threatened to have security drag me out onto the street where he claimed I belonged. They genuinely believed those labels would crush my spirit and force me into quiet submission. They expected me to lower my head, accept their toxic abuse, and fade into the background so their perfect high society illusion could continue uninterrupted. But they were entirely wrong. That label did not break me. It became the ultimate catalyst for their complete and total destruction. If the Carter family had possessed even an ounce of basic human decency, if they had simply treated my sister with a shred of respect, I might have let them live in their pathetic, bankrupt delusion a little bit longer. I might have simply denied their commercial lease renewal quietly through my corporate lawyers and let them figure out their own mess in private behind closed doors. But their obsessive need to humiliate us, their sadistic desire to put the charity cases in their place, forced my hand. Their arrogance blinded them to the reality that the very people they stepped on were the ones quietly holding the keys to their entire kingdom. They handed me the match, and I simply decided to burn their fake empire straight to the ground. That is the beautiful, undeniable irony of people who rely entirely on superficial titles and stolen money to feel powerful. They are hollow, they are terrifyingly fragile. They spend so much energy projecting an image of absolute perfection that they forget to build an actual foundation of character. The Carters built a massive glittering mansion on a foundation of quicksand, and the moment I turned on the lights, the entire thing swallowed them whole. They lost their careers, their social standing, and their freedom because they fundamentally misunderstood what real power looks like. I watched Sydney usher her very first patient through the glass doors. It was a young mother holding a toddler looking completely relieved to finally receive the medical care she deserved. There was no judgment in that lobby. There were no elitist sneers or aggressive demands for gratitude. There was only genuine healing and unwavering support. My sister took the darkest, most painful experience of her entire life and transformed it into a brilliant beacon of hope for other women. She broke the generational curse our deadbeat parents left us, and she completely shattered the toxic cycle the Carters tried to lock her inside. She was finally and absolutely free. We both were. We had walked into that sprawling estate as two orphans expected to bow down to high society, and we walked out as the absolute architects of our own destiny. We did not need their stolen money, their fake connections, or their empty validation to prove our worth. We had each other, and we had the unshakable truth. I smiled, taking one last look at the gleaming silver clinic sign before turning to walk inside and join my sister in her new sanctuary. The past was permanently behind us, and the future was entirely ours to write. Have you ever been completely underestimated by people who thought a fancy title made them better than you? Tell me how you proved them wrong in the comments below. Like and subscribe if you believe karma never misses an address. Share this video with anyone who needs a solid reminder that real power does not come from a leased luxury car or a stolen trust fund. It comes from knowing exactly who you are and never letting a toxic narcissist dictate your worth. Thank you so much for watching our journey. Remember to stay strong, protect your peace, and always keep your receipts. I will see you in the next one.